Bedtime Reading. Sense and Sensibility. Chapter 1. The Dashwood family had long been settled in Sussex in southeastern England. They lived in a grand home at Norland Park, and owned quite a bit of land. The Dashwoods were a respectable family that had lived on the land for generations. The owner of this land was a single man who had lived alone for many years with his sister. But after she died, nearly 10 years before he did, he often invited his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, to come live with him. The old man then decided that, upon his death, he would give his nephew the land and his great home, but told his nephew that he must give the land and home to his son upon his own death. The old man lived quite happily, and grew to love his nephew and his wife dearly, as they treated him quite well, with love and respect. Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, John, with this wife before she died. After some time, he married a kind woman, and they had 3 daughters. The son, a calm, respectable young man, had a great fortune that was given to him by his mother. His own wife, as well, was quite a wealthy woman, so receiving the land at Norland Park was not a great addition to his wealthy fortune. His half-sisters, however, had very little fortune for themselves, as their father had little more than the land he owned before it was given to his son after his death. Their mother, as well, had no fortune to offer the girls either. Just before Mr. Henry Dashwood died, he requested that his son John Dashwood promise him to care for his new mother and his half-sisters. The son then decided to give a present of £1,000 to each of his sisters. He would now be receiving £4,000 a year from the land he would soon receive, in addition to his present income, besides the remaining half of his own mother's fortune. This idea made him feel more generous to his half-sisters. "Yes, I will give them £3,000, and it will be generous and handsome. It will give them freedom from money worries. £3,000! I can allow myself to give them such a great amount, although it will cause me a bit of inconvenience," he thought to himself. He thought with pride about his generous decision to give his sisters the £3,000, and he did not regret that decision. Soon after his father's funeral was over, young Mr. John Dashwood, along with his wife and child, arrived at Norland Park and announced to Mrs. Henry Dashwood and her 3 daughters that they would be moving in. The young couple told the mother and daughters that the 4 were allowed to stay at Norland Park until they were able to find a new home of their own. The mother-in-law and daughters were quite upset with Mrs. John Dashwood's impolite behavior. The home, indeed, now belonged to her and her husband, after Mr. Henry's death, but the mother-in-law was quite upset with such inappropriate and unfeeling behavior towards them, who had just lost their father and husband. Her husband's family never liked Mrs. John Dashwood, as she was always cold and bitter towards them, and this act only worsened their opinion of her. The emotional mother-in-law was quite upset with her Mrs. John Dashwood's behavior, and wished to leave the place immediately. However, her oldest daughter, Elinor, explained calmly that they could not leave yet, as they had no other home to move to. She told her mother that they should begin looking for another home immediately, indeed, but must wait until they found an appropriate home, near Norland Park, of course. Her mother then agreed to remain living with her disliked daughter-in-law, as she cared so deeply for her 3 girls and their happiness. Elinor, the oldest daughter, who had persuaded her mother to remain in the home for a short time, had a calm character that guided her spirit. She was quite reasonable and mature at the age of 19. For this reason, she was able to give her mother such advice and be respected. Her mother was quite different from her first child, in that she was passionate and unexpected, just as her second daughter was as well. Elinor had an excellent heart and strong feelings, but she knew how to handle such passionate emotions better than her mother and sisters. Her mother had not yet learned this, and her younger sister did not wish to learn. Marianne, the second daughter, had excellent abilities, just as Elinor did. She was a clever, but too eager in all her emotions. Her sadness and her happiness were both extreme. She was generous, friendly, and interesting, but never sensible or careful. She was quite like her mother. Elinor noticed her sister's extreme sensibility with a great deal of concern. To their mother, however, Marianne's sensibility and strong emotions were appreciated. Marianne and her mother encouraged each other in their passionate feelings. They experienced the loss of their father and their home with great sadness and emotion. Elinor, too, was deeply hurt, but she could manage her pain in a much more modest way. She could speak with her brother about business matters and greet her sister-in-law without being impolite. Margaret, the youngest sister, was a friendly girl, but watched her older sister, Marianne, carefully, and grew to have strong emotions as well, although she was only 13 and had much to learn. Chapter 2. Mrs. John Dashwood now declared herself to be the mistress of Norland, and her mother and sisters-in-law were now treated as visitors. John Dashwood treated them kindly, and explained that they were welcome to live at Norwood with himself, his wife, and their child until they could find a proper home for themselves. His stepmother, having no other place to live, accepted, but was quite eager to find another home nearby to move to. She was content, however, to continue living in the home that had brought her so much joy. She was thus quite happy to remember her gentle husband, but such memories brought a great deal of pain as well. When Mrs. Dashwood was cheerful, no other person could be more so, but when she was upset, no other on earth could be as sad and disturbed as she. Mrs. Dashwood really had no calm emotions, and felt everything with extreme emotion. Mrs. John Dashwood did not approve of her husband's decision to give each of his sisters £1,000. She often told her husband that giving his half-sisters such a great amount of money would be robbing his own child of his future wealth. Besides, his sisters were only his half-sisters, being that his father had married Mrs. Dashwood after his own mother had died. Therefore, they were hardly related. "It was my father's last request to me," replied her husband, "that I should assist his wife and daughters."
He did not know what he was talking of, as he was near death and could not think correctly. Otherwise, he would never have asked you to take part of your son's fortune away from him.
He did not ask for a particular amount of money, my dear Fanny. He only requested that I help make their lives more comfortable, as he can no longer help them. I promised my father I would help them, so I must help them when they leave Norland and settle in a new home.
Well, please help them, but you do not have to give them £3,000. That money will never be returned. What will our poor son do?
Yes, that amount of money would make quite a difference indeed. Perhaps when our little Harry will have a large family some day, and greatly need that £3,000.
Yes, indeed.
Perhaps then it would be better for everyone if I gave each of the girls £500 instead of 1,000. £500 would be a great increase to their fortunes.
Oh, yes, you would be an excellent brother for it, and they are only half-sisters. They could not expect to receive more than that.
They cannot think, then, that I have not helped them to live in comfort.
Yes, if you believe that you are able to afford that amount. £1,500 is still a great deal of money.
Certainly, and I think I can afford to give them £500 each. Without any more from me, they will each have £3,000 when their mother dies, which is a comfortable fortune for any young woman.
It is a great fortune. Together they will have nearly £10,000, a great fortune indeed.
That is true, and therefore I wonder if perhaps I should instead give something to their mother, as the girls each have a fortune and will marry wealthy men. £100 a year would make them all perfectly comfortable. His wife did not agree with this plan, however.
I believe it would be better to give them £1,500 rather than give their mother £100 a year, as she could live far longer than 15 years. She could live for many more years than 15, which could be quite expensive.
15 years? My dear Fanny, she cannot live more than 7 or 8.
Perhaps not, but people always live longer if they are paid for it. She is healthy and only 40 years old. Yearly payments can be troublesome. When my father died, my mother promised to pay yearly payments to 3 servants, and it was quite a bother to her. She could not spend her money freely, as she had those troublesome payments each year.
It is certainly an unpleasant thing, replied Mr. Dashwood.
No doubt, and you would receive no thanks for it. If I were you, I would not promise them yearly payments because they will always expect them. It may be very inconvenient some years to give them 100 or even £50.
I believe you are right, my love. It will be better if I give them a present of £50 when I have the money to give them.
Indeed, and I believe your father did not know you planned to give them money at all. The help he thought of was only to help them move into a new home. Your sisters and mother will be quite comfortable with £7,000 together. They will live so cheap. They will have no carriages, no horses, and hardly any servants.
I believe you are right. My father certainly meant no more than what you said. I understand now. When my mother moves to another house, I am no longer responsible to care for them.
Certainly,
responded Mrs. John Dashwood, satisfied with her husband's decision. Chapter 3. Mrs. Dashwood remained at Norland for several months with her 3 daughters. Although she loved her home dearly, she was anxious to leave, as Mrs. John Dashwood was quite disagreeable to her. The mother and 3 daughters decided that they must find a home near Norland, as leaving it would be unthinkable. They had looked at several homes nearby, but Elinor had rejected them, as they were too expensive for their small income. Before his death, Mrs. Dashwood's husband had informed her of his son's promise to take care of her and her 3 daughters. She trusted that his promise was true, and was content that her daughters would not have to worry about income. She felt guilty for previously not trusting him to be a generous individual, but now believed he would indeed help them. Mrs. Dashwood had never liked the younger Mrs. John Dashwood, and never trusted the young woman. Since the young couple and their child had moved into Norland, the mother's feelings towards her daughter-in-law had become worse. Mrs. Dashwood wished to leave Norland after a short time, but Elinor explained that they first must find a suitable home. During their time at Norland, Elinor became quite close to the brother of Mrs. John Dashwood, Edward Ferrars, a pleasing young man, who often came for visits after Mrs. John Dashwood and her husband moved to Norland. Some mothers might encourage their child to marry for wealth or for fame, but Mrs. Dashwood believed Edward Ferrars to be friendly and in love with her daughter. Therefore, Mrs. Dashwood was quite content that her daughter began a relationship with the agreeable young man, who was also quite wealthy. Edward Ferrars was not handsome nor talkative, but was honest, with an open heart. His mother and sister wished for him to gain a respected position in the government, but young Edward had no desire for fame or to improve his position in society. Edward Ferrars wished for only a quiet, comfortable life. Fortunately, he had a younger brother, Robert, who was more interested in fame. Edward had been staying several weeks at Norland before Mrs. Dashwood knew him well, but Elinor suggested that their mother speak with him more often. Mrs. Dashwood then made several efforts to know Edward Ferrars, and she was soon quite fond of the young man. She believed, as well, the young man was in love with her oldest daughter, and expected them to marry soon.
"In a few months, my dear Marianne,"
said she,
"Elinor will be married. We shall miss her, but she will be happy. Oh, mamma, how shall we live without her? My dear, it will hardly be a separation. We shall live close, and shall meet every day. You will gain a brother, a real caring brother. Edward is a wonderful man. But you look worried, Marianne. Do you disapprove of him?" "Perhaps,"
said Marianne.
"I am surprised at my sister's choice. Edward is friendly, and I love him, but he is not handsome or charming. Besides, he has no real talents. He does not know music, and though he appreciates Elinor's drawings very much, he knows nothing about drawing himself. He appreciates her drawings as a lover would, not as an artist. I could not be happy with such a man. He should have the same interest as I. The same books, the same music must charm us both. Oh, mamma, how untalented Edward is! However, Elinor does not have my feelings, and therefore she might be happy with him. Remember, my love, that you are not yet 17. It is still too early for you to worry about not finding love."
Chapter 4.
"What a pity it is, Elinor,"
said Marianne,
"that Edward knows nothing about drawing." "Why do you think so?"
replied Elinor.
"Although he is not an artist himself, he enjoys others' work. I believe that if he ever learned to draw, he would have excellent skills."
Marianne was afraid of upsetting Elinor, and so said no more.
"I hope,"
continued Elinor,
"that you know he does have many talents and excellent qualities. I know you must know. I believe you do, indeed, as I know you would never speak him if you did not respect his talents."
Marianne could say nothing. She did not wish to hurt her sister's feelings, but had to speak again.
"I hope I have not upset you, Elinor. I think Edward is friendly and good." "I am pleased to hear such words about him,"
replied Elinor with a smile. Marianne was overjoyed to see her sister so easily pleased.
"His sense and his goodness,"
continued Elinor,
"are wonderful, and I understand that his artistic skills are limited, but I have observed him a great deal since his arrival at Norland, and I know he has many abilities. He is honest and tender, which only improves his character as a worthy gentleman. I know him well and care for him deeply. What do you say, Marianne?" I shall very soon view him in the same manner you do. I shall love him as a brother very soon."
Elinor was shocked to hear such words and regretted having had such a conversation with her sister. She cared for Edward a great deal and knew he cared for her as well. However, she knew that she and Edward were not close enough to think of marriage yet. She knew that once Marianne and her mother had a new idea, they would soon believe that to be true, and then expect such an event to happen. She tried to explain the real situation to her sister.
"Although I care a great deal for Edward, and I believe he cares for me, we have never spoken of marriage. I believe he cares for me deeply, but you must remember, Marianne, he is not independently wealthy. We know nothing of his mother, but we have heard that she is very much like her unfeeling daughter, who is married to our brother. Both Edward's sister and mother wish him to be successful and marry a woman of fortune. If he wished to marry me, a woman with neither a great fortune nor high position in society, his mother and sister would surely oppose such a decision."
Marianne was astonished to discover how she and her mother had forgotten such considerations as Edward's mother and sister.
"And you really have not spoken of marriage with him?"
she asked.
"Yet it certainly soon will happen, and now I will have more opportunities to see his wonderful talents. How delightful it would be if he learned how to draw."
Elinor had given her real opinion to her sister. She could not consider that she and Edward would soon be married. She understood that Edward's mother was rather strict and forced him to follow her orders, which often did not please him. The longer Elinor was with Edward, the more doubtful she felt that they would be married. At times she felt with great pain that there was only friendship between them. Edward's sister, as well, did not approve of his interest in Elinor. She spoke with her mother-in-law about it, explaining that Edward was to have a high position in society and would only marry a wealthy, high-class woman, but of course would not marry for several years. Mrs. Dashwood, of course, became quite angry at hearing this, and left the room immediately, swearing that she and her daughters would leave very soon, as her daughter should not have to bear hearing such opinions. Soon after this event, a letter was delivered to her, which explained of a small cottage for rent. The letter was from a distant relative of the Dashwoods, Sir John Middleton, the owner of the land. He explained that he knew she was in need of a home, and offered this cottage for quite reasonable rent. He requested that Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters come for a visit to see the cottage and meet his family. Although Devonshire, where the cottage was quite far from Norland Park, the family decided to go for the visit, as they were quite tired of living with their brother's cold, unfeeling wife. Chapter 5. Immediately after Mrs. Dashwood sent a letter to her kind cousin accepting his offer, she then proudly announced to her son-in-law and his wife that she was provided with a house and should be leaving quite soon. They were rather surprised. Mrs. John Dashwood said nothing, but her husband politely told the older Mrs. Dashwood that he hoped they would not be moving far away. She then informed him they would be going to Devonshire, quite a distance from Norland Park. Edward quickly turned to Mrs. Dashwood in surprise and concern.
"It is only a cottage,"
she continued,
"but I hope to see many of my friends come visit."
She ended her speech with a very kind offer to Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood to visit her there. She then sweetly invited Edward to come visit at any time. She was quite satisfied with herself, as this invitation for Edward to come visit them showed his sister that she was not concerned about the growing love between her oldest daughter and Edward Ferrars. Mr. John Dashwood told his mother again and again how sorry he was that they were going to be so far from Norland. He had felt a bit guilty for not helping his mother and sisters any more than he had, but his wife did not seem concerned. When she saw them leave, she pitied them, however, as she knew their income would now be considerably less than that of she and her husbands. Mrs. Dashwood immediately began making preparations to leave Norland Park. She looked forward to her son's promise to her husband that he would provide for she and her daughters with some income. However, she realized after a great deal of time that he would not keep his promise to his father to provide his sisters and their mother with any income. Instead, he continually complained of the great expense to care for them for the past 6 months at Norland. In a very few weeks, Sir John Middleton sent a letter explaining that the cottage was now ready for rent. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters then began preparing for their journey. The 4 women cried many tears before leaving their beloved Norland Park. Chapter 6. The first part of the journey was filled with sadness. However, they began to look forward to seeing their new home, away from their insensitive sister-in-law, who caused them a great deal of pain. Barton Cottage was quite small, but still comfortable and charming. In comparison with Norland, it was poor and small indeed, but the 4 women appeared to look excited about their new home. The next morning, soon after breakfast, Sir John Middleton arrived for a visit. He was a good-looking man of about 40, quite friendly and helpful. He insisted that they dine at his home until they were fully moved into their new home. After he left, a large basket full of garden vegetables and fruit arrived, and later in the day a present of meat came, all from Sir Middleton, to welcome them. Mrs. Dashwood was rather satisfied with the size and furniture of the house, although she planned to do many additions to the house in the future.
"As for the house itself, to be sure,"
said she,
"it is too small for our family, but we will make ourselves comfortable for the present, as it is too late in the year for improvements. Perhaps in the spring, if I have plenty of money, we shall improve the house."
In the meantime, till all the improvements could be made from the savings of an income of £500 a year by a woman who never saved in her life, the family was wise enough to be content with the house as it was. Lady Middleton soon sent a polite message to Mrs. Dashwood, requesting to visit her new neighbours when they were settled in their new home. Mrs. Dashwood immediately sent a message back, and the 5 women met the next day. The Dashwoods were quite anxious to meet the high-class Lady Middleton. In fact, she was elegant with excellent manners. She was a beauty of nearly 27, quite graceful and tall. Her manners were much more graceful than her husband's. Indeed, although the Dashwood women noticed that she was quite cold and had nothing to say for herself aside from common greetings. Although her husband lacked her grace and elegance, he was a warm and friendly man. Chapter 7. Barton Park, where Sir and Lady Middleton lived, was about half a mile from the cottage. The ladies had passed near it upon arriving at the cottage. The house was large and handsome, and the Middletons lived in style, always with friends staying with them in the house to keep them company. Both Sir and Lady preferred to invite friends to stay with them. Sir Middleton enjoyed hunting with friends, while Lady Middleton delighted in caring for her children, but preferred to have other mothers and children around as well. During their many dinner parties, Lady Middleton enjoyed showing off the elegance of her dinners. But Sir John's satisfaction in having such events was more real. He delighted in collecting more young people around him than his house would hold. The noisier the house, the happier was Sir John. The arrival of a new family in the area was always a matter of joy to him. He was charmed with the new neighbours in his cottage. The Miss Dashwoods were young, pretty, and honest. Sir John could not be more delighted. The Dashwoods were invited for dinner the next evening at Barton Park. He repeated many times that he was sorry he could not bring any smart young men to meet them for dinner. There was, in fact, only one other gentleman present, aside from Sir John himself. This other man was a dear friend of Sir John's, Colonel Brandon. Although he was certainly not charming and friendly like Sir John, Lady Middleton's mother was present as well, who was quite a friendly, agreeable old woman. Mrs. Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, was a good-humored, merry, fat old woman who talked a great deal, seemed very happy, and rather ill-mannered. She was full of jokes and laughter, and before dinner was over she had said many things about lovers and husbands. She mentioned that she hoped the girls had not left their hearts at Norland, then laughed to herself. Marianne was quite worried about her sister, as she knew Elinor was still rather upset about leaving Edward to move to Barton Cottage. Colonel Brandon, the friend of Sir John, was quiet and serious. His appearance, however, was not unpleasing. Although Marianne and Margaret believed him to be an old man, as he was nearly 35, he looked sensible and gentlemanlike. In the evening, Sir John requested that Marianne sing for the group, after he discovered that she was musical. Marianne sang quite well, and the group praised her after every song. Sir John was loud in congratulating her after each song, and as loud in his conversation with the others while every song lasted. Lady Middleton frequently requested him to quiet himself, wondering how anyone could not pay attention to the music for one moment, although she once asked Marianne to sing a particular song that Marianne had just finished. Colonel Brandon, alone, of all the party, quietly and patiently listened to her play. Marianne respected him for his quiet attention, which the others did not give her. Chapter 8. Mrs. Jennings's husband had died many years ago, leaving her a great fortune to spend happily, as both of her daughters had already married wealthy husbands. She was quick at discovering secret relationships between young people, and enjoyed embarrassing such couples in public. Soon after her arrival at Barton Park, she announced that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne Dashwood. It would be an excellent match, for he was rich and she was handsome, she often declared. Mrs. Jennings had been anxious to find Colonel Brandon a wife, since they had met soon after her daughter was married to Sir John, and she was always anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. Marianne was rather confused, as she felt Colonel Brandon to be quite an old man at 35 years old, and pitied him in that he had not found love in his younger years. Her mother, however, could not believe a man 5 years younger than herself to be old.
But at least, Mamma, you cannot deny how foolish Mrs. Jennings is in her belief that Colonel Brandon and I could marry. He's old enough to be my father, and if he were ever alive enough to be in love, he must have lost that feeling long ago. Are you calling him weak?
Asked Elinor.
I know you look at him as much older than our mother does, but you must not call him weak. He is but 35 years old. My dear child,
began their mother, laughing.
If you believe Colonel Brandon to be old, you must think I will soon die, as I am still older than Colonel Brandon. Mamma, I know he is not near the age of death, but at 35 years old he should not be thinking of marriage. Perhaps,
said Elinor,
a man of 35 and a young woman of 17 should not think of marrying. But if there is a woman who is single at 27, I think Colonel Brandon could marry her. A woman of 27,
said Marianne, after a moment of silence,
can never feel love again. If she has a small fortune, she cannot think she will ever marry. In his marrying such a woman, it would be an agreement for convenience. I believe, however, such a marriage would mean nothing without true love felt for each other. This would simply be a business exchange.
Soon after this conversation ended, Elinor left the room. Marianne then turned to her mother with a worried look.
"Mamma,"
she said,
"I am sure Edward Ferrars is not well. We have now been here almost 2 weeks, and yet he does not come to visit. Why has he not come yet?" "Why did you think he might come so soon for a visit?"
said Mrs. Dashwood.
"I did not believe he would come so early. Does Elinor expect him already?" "I have never mentioned it to her, but of course she must." "I rather think you are mistaken. She has not spoken of Edward Ferrars coming for a visit." "How strange this is! Their goodbye to each other was rather cold and unfeeling. That last evening together, their conversation was rather dull and weak."
Chapter 9. The Dashwoods were now settled at Barton. The house and the garden were now becoming familiar to them. Sir John Middleton, who visited them every day for the first 2 weeks, was always surprised at finding them busy with various activities when he arrived for a visit. They had few visitors at the cottage, and did not wish to meet with the neighbors a great deal, although Sir John attempted several times to introduce them to many of the neighbors. The mother and daughters allowed themselves only to visit the neighbors within walking distance from the cottage. On a walk one day, they walked near a respectable-looking old respectable house called Allenham, which reminded them a bit of Norland. They were curious about the owner, but quickly discovered that the owner was a good old woman, Mrs. Smith, who was unfortunately too ill to leave her home at any time. The Dashwood women enjoyed the beautiful walks through the valleys and hills surrounding the area. One morning, Marianne and Margaret took a long walk through the area. As they were returning to the cottage, they decided to run down the nearest hill to the house. As they were running, however, Marianne fell and hurt her foot. A man who had been hunting nearby saw Marianne fall and ran to help her. He gently picked her up and carried her to the cottage. Elinor and her mother looked at them in surprise. They were secretly quite pleased with the appearance of the handsome stranger. He apologized for surprising them, and requested to return the next day to visit Marianne. He introduced himself as Willoughby, and he explained that he was currently living at Allenham with his aunt, Mrs. Smith, whom he visited once a year. Mrs. Dashwood happily agreed that he return the following day, and he departed as gracefully as he had arrived. Sir John came to see them the next morning after he had heard the news of Marianne's injured foot. Marianne immediately began asking questions about the mysterious Willoughby. "Willoughby?" cried Sir John. "Is he in the area now? That is good news. I will go over tomorrow and ask him to dinner on Thursday."
"You know him, then?"
asked Mrs. Dashwood. "Yes, very well. He comes here every year."
"And what sort of young man is he?"
"He is a very kind young gentleman, I assure you," replied Sir John.
"Is that all you know of him?"
asked Marianne, looking annoyed.
"What are his interests and talents?"
"Well," said he, "I do not know much about him, but he is pleasant and friendly, and has got the nicest little black bitch of a hunting dog I ever saw. Was she out hunting with him?" Marianne was quite dissatisfied with his answer.
"But who is he?"
asked Elinor.
"Where does he come from? Does he have a house at Allenham?"
Sir John then explained that Mr. Willoughby had no property of his own in the area, but he lived there while visiting the old lady who was his aunt. He was to receive her land and fortune at her death. "He is a good young man, I believe," repeated Sir John. "I remember last Christmas At a dance at Barton Park, he danced from 8 o'clock till 4 without once sitting down."
"Did he indeed?"
cried Marianne with excitement.
"And with grace and elegance."
"Yes, and he was up the next morning at 8 for hunting."
"That is what a young man should be like. That is what I like. He should be eager in all his interests."
"I understand now. You have chosen your husband now, and will not look at poor Colonel Brandon any longer," said Sir John with a smile. "Poor Brandon." Chapter 10. Willoughby came to the cottage the next morning to see Marianne. Mrs. Dashwood was more than polite to him, showing kindness, elegance, and charm. Miss Elinor Dashwood had a pretty figure and a regular face. Marianne was still handsomer. She was not as tall as her sister, but many called her beautiful, with a lovely smile and attractive figure. Marianne was delighted with the handsome Willoughby. He was a perfect gentleman, and when Marianne heard him declare that music and dancing were two of his favorite activities, she was thoroughly impressed with this young man. It was only necessary to mention any of Marianne's favorite activities for her to begin talking. She could not be silent when discussing art and music. The two soon discovered that they both greatly enjoyed dancing and music. They then began discussing books, and realized they shared the same favorite books. Their likes were quite similar. The same books, the same quotes were remembered by both. They were soon speaking to each other as if they were old friends.
"Well, Marianne,"
said Elinor as soon as he had left them,
"you have spoken of all your favorite subjects in one morning with your new friend. What will you discuss during his next visit, as you have spoken of almost all you know?" "Elinor,"
cried Marianne,
"is this fair? But I see what you mean. You think I should have been dull and spoken only of the weather and simple matters, just as a polite young woman should. If I had spoken this way, then you would not disturb me as you do now." "My love,"
said her mother,
"you must not be angry with Elinor. She was only joking."
Willoughby seemed to enjoy his visit to the Dashwood home, and returned every day after. At first, he claimed that he was coming to ask about Marianne's hurt foot, but after some time he came just to see the family, as he realized they were delighted to see him as well. His visits became Marianne's main enjoyment of the day. They read, they talked, they sang together. He was a talented musician, as she was herself. Mrs. Dashwood believed him to be a perfect gentleman, and Elinor observed that he was very much like her sister, passionate about all his interests, saying too much what he thought on every occasion, without attention to the situation. He quickly gave his opinions of other people, although such opinions were perhaps not polite in the situation. Elinor saw these qualities in her sister as well. Elinor now noticed Colonel Brandon's interest in her sister with great concern. At first, when Mrs. Jennings had announced Colonel Brandon to be in love with Marianne, Elinor did not entirely believe the old woman. Now, however, she saw that Colonel Brandon was greatly in love with her sister. She pitied the poor man, as his rival for Marianne's love was a lively, talkative young man of 25, whereas Colonel Brandon himself was a shy, rather silent man of 35. Elinor truly respected Colonel Brandon, although he was rather serious and quiet, and she sincerely hoped that Colonel Brandon's interest in her sister would soon end, as she saw he could never be successful against the young Willoughby. Marianne and Willoughby did not view Colonel Brandon in the same way. They rather disliked him for his being older, with quiet, serious manners. "Colonel Brandon is the kind of man," said Willoughby one day, "that everyone likes and nobody cares about, whom all are delighted to see and nobody remembers to talk to."
"That is exactly what I think of him,"
cried Marianne.
Colonel Brandon is a sensible man,
said Elinor.
Yes, although he is a man between 30 and 40, but he has seen a great deal of the world and has considerable knowledge on many subjects.
Chapter 11. The Dashwoods had not known how many invitations to dinners and parties they would receive after arriving at Barton. Now they had little time for their usual activities at home, as Sir John had previously been forming many dances and dinners at his home. Once Marianne recovered from her fall, Sir John again began planning such grand events. Willoughby, of course, was invited to all the gatherings as well, and soon became quite familiar with the Dashwood family. Elinor was not surprised that Willoughby and Marianne had shown interest in each other, but she did suggest to Marianne that they should not be so open about their love for each other. Marianne declared that she could not hide her love for Willoughby, and continued in the same manner, although Elinor worried that such behavior was not appropriate in strict high-class society. When Willoughby was present, Marianne spoke to only him. Everything he did was right, and everything he said was clever. If there was dancing, they would dance together the whole night, or were standing nearby each other. Everyone else, of course, laughed at them a great deal, but they were determined to spend every moment together. Mrs. Dashwood supported the two in their love, as she believed strong emotions should be shown to all. During this time, Marianne was in perfect happiness, as she was very much in love with the handsome Willoughby. She began to forget her beloved Norland, as she was now occupied with her new love. Elinor's happiness was not so great. She missed the lively conversations she used to have with Edward while at Norland. Here in Barton Park, neither Lady Middleton nor Mrs. Jennings interested her, although Mrs. Jennings could talk a great deal about silly, unimportant matters. She had told Elinor 3 times already of her life story, as Elinor was one of her favorite young ladies to talk to. Elinor favored spending time with Lady Middleton, only because she was more silent than her mother, Mrs. Jennings. Lady Middleton rarely spoke during evening parties at Barton Park, as she was interested only in looking elegant and high class. No one usually noticed her during such events, as she spoke very little. She had no desire to know anyone very well. Of all her new friends, Elinor believed Colonel Brandon to be the most pleasing. He was a respectable gentleman, quiet yet clever. Unfortunately, Colonel Brandon had no encouragement for Marianne falling in love with him, but was grateful for Elinor's friendship and attention. Elinor's respect for him increased after she suspected him of having lost a love in the past. Elinor discovered this information during an evening party at Barton Park, when they were sitting down while the others were dancing. He was watching Marianne dance, and after a silence he said with a smile, "Your sister has said that she does not approve of second loves."
No,
replied Elinor.
her opinions are all romantic. She believes we should all fall in love only once.
Or rather, she believes second loves are impossible to exist.
I believe she does, but I do not know how she can believe such things. Her own father had 2 wives. In a few years, however, she will think more reasonably, not so foolishly romantic.
Elinor responded. Yes, she probably will. But a young person's passionate opinions about love are so charming, much more so than those calm feelings of someone older.
I do not agree with you,
said Elinor.
Her opinions are childish and improper.
After a short silence, Colonel Brandon spoke again. Does your sister explain why she does not agree with the idea of second loves? Perhaps there are some who have lost their first love. Are they to be punished by never having a second?
She has never told me her reasons.
I once knew a young woman who was very much like your sister, but was forced to leave her first love because of an unfortunate situation." Here he stopped suddenly, thinking he had said too much. Elinor then began to think that perhaps the colonel had a particular fondness for this woman he had just spoken of. Chapter 12. As Elinor and Marianne were walking together the next morning, Marianne announced that Willoughby had given her a horse as a gift that would soon be delivered. Without considering that their cottage has no place to keep a horse, Marianne had accepted the gift.
"He intends for his servant to bring the horse immediately from Somersetshire, his home,"
she added.
"and when it arrives, we will ride every day."
Marianne was quite unwilling to understand that accepting such a gift was not possible for their small income. This was too much. Soon after, however, Elinor persuaded her sister to decline Willoughby's generous offer. That same day, Willoughby arrived for a visit, during which Marianne sadly told him she could not accept his gift. "But, Marianne, the horse is still yours. I will keep it until you leave the cottage to find your own home." After hearing such a tender, honest response, Elinor realized that Willoughby and her sister had quite a serious relationship. He had called her by her first name, only used by close friends and family or a lover. The next day Margaret came to Elinor with more news of Marianne's close relationship with Willoughby.
"Oh, Elinor,"
cried Margaret.
"I have such a secret to tell you about Marianne."
She told her sister with a cheerful smile.
"I know Marianne will marry Willoughby soon. I saw him cut off a piece of her hair to keep for himself."
Such an act as cutting off a lock of hair from a lover was quite serious. Therefore, Elinor was surprised to hear such news. She then knew that the growing fondness between Marianne and Willoughby was true. Chapter 13. One morning late in the fall, the Dashwoods were having breakfast at Barton Park with the Middletons, Mrs. Jennings, Willoughby, and Colonel Brandon, after which they planned to spend the day together picnicking nearby. It was quite late in the season for traveling, but the party was pleased for the adventure. The morning mail was brought in while they were sitting together. Among the rest there was one for Colonel Brandon. He looked at the address on the envelope and immediately left the room looking quite disturbed. "What is the matter with Brandon?" said Sir John. No one else knew.
"I hope he has not received bad news,"
said Lady Middleton.
"It must be something important for Colonel Brandon to leave my breakfast table so suddenly."
In about 5 minutes he returned.
"No bad news, Colonel, I hope,"
said Mrs. Jennings, as soon as he entered the room. "None at all, madam, thank you. It was only a business letter coming from London."
"But why did you become so upset when you received the letter? Come now, Colonel, let us hear the truth. Remember what you are saying,"
Lady Middleton said, scolding her mother for such impoliteness.
"Well, I know who the letter is from, Colonel, and I hope she is well,"
Mrs. Jennings said to Colonel Brandon with a smile. The colonel, however, disregarded her comment. "I am quite sorry, madam," continued Colonel Brandon, speaking to Lady Middleton. "I must immediately go to London for business."
"To London?"
cried Mrs. Jennings.
"What can you have to do in town this late in the fall?"
"I'm sorry. I must leave immediately. I must not wait for even an hour." Elinor then heard Willoughby say in a low voice to Marianne, "There are some people who cannot bear a party of pleasure. I believe Brandon wrote that letter himself as a way to excuse himself from going on a picnic with us. I'm sure he is simply afraid of catching a cold."
"I have no doubt of it,"
replied Marianne. Colonel Brandon then apologized once more for leaving so suddenly before exiting the room. The party was quite surprised at the Colonel's hurried goodbye. Soon after he left, Mrs. Jennings began to speak.
"I know what his business is,"
she said confidently.
"Do you?"
said almost everybody.
"Yes. It's about Miss Williams, I'm sure." "And who is Miss Williams?"
asked Marianne.
"What? You do not know who Miss Williams is? I'm sure you must have heard of her before. She is a relation of the Colonel's, a very near relation. I will not say how near, for fear of shocking the young ladies."
Then, in a whisper, she said to Elinor,
"She is his natural daughter."
Sir John then came back into the room after saying good-bye to the Colonel, so the subject of Miss Williams was not spoken of any longer. Soon after breakfast ended, the carriages were called to the house for the guests to leave, as they would no longer go on a picnic without Colonel Brandon. Willoughby's carriage arrived first. Marianne had never looked so pleased before in her life as she did stepping into his carriage. The two left immediately, and were not seen for the rest of the day. When they returned for dinner, Mrs. Jennings turned to Marianne, speaking quietly.
"I have found you out. I know where you two spent the morning."
Marianne looked quite embarrassed.
"I hope you like Willoughby's aunt's house, Marianne, and I hope that when you two are married you will decorate the home with more style."
Marianne turned away in great confusion. Mrs. Jennings had discovered, through one of her servants, that Willoughby had taken Marianne to see his aunt's home, where he was staying for his yearly visit to her. Upon his aunt's death, he would receive his aunt's home and fortune. Marianne was quite embarrassed that Mrs. Jennings had discovered her secret trip to Willoughby's home, as women of that time would not visit their lover's home unless they were soon to marry. Otherwise, such behavior was quite improper. Elinor could hardly believe this to be true, as it seemed very unlikely that Willoughby should propose marriage to Marianne, or that Marianne would agree to enter Mrs. Smith's home, whom she had never met. Soon after dinner, Elinor spoke to her sister about the matter, and was quite surprised to find that Marianne had, indeed, gone to visit the home with Willoughby. Elinor attempted to explain how improper such a visit was, but Marianne insisted that their visit to Willoughby's home was pleasant, and she saw no disrespect in her visit.
"I do not believe I have done anything wrong in walking on Mrs. Smith's grounds or in seeing her house. They will one day be Mr. Willoughby's, and—" "If you marry Willoughby, and the home will be your own one day, Marianne, you would still not be justified in what you have done."
Marianne then looked quite embarrassed. After some time, Marianne returned to her sister and said with a smile,
"Perhaps, Elinor, it was foolish of me to visit Mrs. Smith's home, but Mr. Willoughby wanted to show me the place. It is a charming house."
Marianne then continued to explain the house in detail. Chapter 14. For the next 2 or 3 days, Mrs. Jennings wondered a great deal about Colonel Brandon's mysterious reason for leaving so suddenly. Perhaps it was about Miss Williams. She is always so sick. Or perhaps the Colonel's sister is ill, and has requested that he go see her. Maybe he had to return home for troubling money matters. But Colonel Brandon has an income of £2,000 a year, so it cannot be money concerns. I wonder what it can be. Well, I hope his troubles are soon over so he can return to us quickly, perhaps with a good wife as well. Though Elinor felt quite interested in the well-being of Colonel Brandon, her interest did not compare to that of Mrs. Jennings, who was constantly thinking of new reasons for the Colonel's mysterious leaving. Elinor thought more often of her sister's new connection to Willoughby. Marianne had not announced an engagement to Willoughby, and Elinor knew she could not simply ask her sister if the two were indeed engaged, as she believed Marianne would tell her nothing. As this silence continued, Willoughby and Marianne looked more in love with each day, but there was no news of a marriage. Elinor knew that a marriage between the two was not immediately possible, as Willoughby's income from his land was only 600 or 700 pounds per year, although he received a great deal more from his aunt. His aunt would surely not easily approve of a marriage between Willoughby and Marianne, as she had so little wealth for herself. Chapter 15. One morning Mrs. Dashwood visited Lady Middleton with two of her daughters, but Marianne declined to go, explaining that she had business at home to attend to. Her mother believed, however, that Willoughby had promised to visit her while the three were at the Middletons, and was perfectly satisfied with her remaining at home. On their return from the Middletons, the three women walked into the cottage only to see Marianne run upstairs crying. Willoughby then walked out of the sitting-room where Marianne had run from. He turned to Mrs. Dashwood and her two daughters with a nervous smile.
"Is there anything the matter with her?"
cried Mrs. Dashwood as she entered.
"Is she ill?"
"I hope not," he replied, trying to look cheerful. "It is I who might soon be ill, for I am now quite disappointed."
"Disappointed?"
"Yes. Mrs. Smith has this morning announced that I must immediately leave for London to do business for her."
"This is very unfortunate. I hope you will not be gone long,"
Mrs. Dashwood said feelingly. He looked embarrassed as he replied, "You are very kind, but I will not be immediately returning. My visits to Mrs. Smith are never more than once a year."
"And is Mrs. Smith your only friend in the neighborhood? You are perfectly welcome to come visit us at the cottage, Willoughby."
He looked more embarrassed and only replied, "You are too kind." Mrs. Dashwood looked at Elinor with surprise. Willoughby's manner in leaving them, his embarrassment, and unwillingness to accept her mother's invitation greatly disturbed Elinor. Her mother had more confidence in Willoughby, and trusted that he had a good reason for leaving them.
"Elinor, you love to doubt. It will not satisfy you to trust in someone. I believe that Mrs. Smith suspects that he is in love with Marianne, and disapproves of it because she has such a small fortune, and has invented a reason for him to go to London. You are so distrustful of people. You are so quick to blame Willoughby, rather than pity him for having to leave us. We have not heard if Marianne and Willoughby are indeed engaged. I can understand his reasons for keeping such news a secret from his aunt, but not from us. How can he leave her without knowing when he will return to see her? My Elinor, is it possible to doubt their engagement? He must and does love her, I am sure,"
answered her mother.
"I hope they are truly engaged, and Willoughby will soon return. But he just left my sister in pain, which worries me."
Chapter 16. Marianne slept very little that night, and woke up the next morning with a headache and pain in her heart. She refused to eat, and soon after breakfast went out to walk around, remembering the walks she used to take with Willoughby, crying as she went. After returning to the cottage, she spent the rest of the day playing Willoughby's favorite songs on the piano, stopping often to burst into tears. After a few days of crying to herself, she became more calm, but remained quiet in her sadness. No letter from Willoughby came, which did not surprise Marianne. Her mother was shocked, however, and Elinor again became worried. But Mrs. Dashwood could always give a reason for a letter not yet arriving.
"Remember, Elinor,"
said she,
"Sir John always receives our mail for us. This engagement between Marianne and Willoughby must remain a secret. Therefore Willoughby knows he must not write, for fear that Sir John and the others would discover the truth.
Elinor agreed, but was still quite uneasy about the situation.
Why do you not ask Marianne if she is indeed engaged to Willoughby? Surely she would tell her loving mother the truth.
Elinor said to her mother.
Of course not. Perhaps they are not engaged. Such a question would only bring her more pain and suffering.
Elinor thought her mother's reason was a bit foolish, considering that Marianne was only 17 years old. She again suggested that her mother ask, but Mrs. Dashwood was far more romantic than practical. Several days passed before Willoughby's name was spoken in Marianne's presence. One evening Mrs. Dashwood picked up a book that Willoughby had been reading to them during the evenings.
We have never finished our reading, Marianne. Our dear Willoughby went away before we could finish it. We will put it away until he returns, but it may be months, perhaps, before he returns. Months?
Cried Marianne with strong surprise.
No, nor many weeks.
Mrs. Dashwood was sorry for what she had said, but Elinor was pleased that Marianne's response was so confident that Willoughby would soon be returning. One morning, about a week after Willoughby's departure, Marianne decided to join her sisters on a morning walk. This was the first time since Willoughby's leaving that she had not gone off walking alone. As they were walking, they saw a man on horseback coming towards them.
It is Willoughby. I know it is. Indeed, Marianne, I think you are mistaken. It is not Willoughby,
cried Elinor.
I am sure he has come. I know how soon he would come.
Marianne then began walking forward quickly, but was soon disappointed to discover it was Edward Ferrars who was coming to see them. Although Marianne was disappointed that her beloved Willoughby had not come to meet her, she was delighted for her sister, and welcomed Edward with great cheerfulness. Marianne asked Edward if he came directly from London. No, he had been in Devonshire for nearly 2 weeks.
2 weeks,
Marianne repeated, surprised that he had been so long near Elinor without seeing her earlier. He looked rather nervous as he added that he had been staying with some friends, although he said nothing more about such friends. During their conversation, Elinor was quite shocked at Edward's cold behavior towards them. Chapter 17. Mrs. Dashwood was surprised only for a moment at seeing him, as his coming to Barton seemed quite natural to her. During the visit, the Dashwood women noticed that he remained nervous. During dinner, they began speaking of wealth and fortune, which Mrs. Ferrars, Edward's mother, wished for him. Only a woman of fortune would be sufficient for her son. My only wish in life is to be perfectly happy, although my mother wishes for me to become a city or government official, quite a high-class position, he told them. However, Edward had no desire for employment.
How strange,
cried Marianne.
What connection do wealth and elegance have with happiness? Elegance has very little,
said Elinor.
But wealth has much to do with it. Elinor,
said Marianne,
money can only give happiness when there is nothing else to give. Well,
said Elinor,
what do you believe a proper income to be, Marianne? About 1,800 or 2,000 pounds a year, not more than that.
Elinor laughed.
2,000 a year. 1,000 is my only fortune. And yet 2,000 a year is a modest income,
said Marianne.
A family cannot live comfortably for less. A proper home with servants and a carriage, perhaps 2.
Elinor smiled again to hear her sister describe such expenses, as she knew Marianne was thinking of Combe Magna, Willoughby's country home. Chapter 18. Elinor saw with great uneasiness the nervousness of poor Edward. She was delighted to see him, indeed, but was quite worried, seeing that he was so unhappy. The next morning he joined Elinor and Marianne at the breakfast table before the others came down. Marianne immediately left the room, as she wished to give the two time to speak alone. Just a moment after, Edward stood up to leave, announcing that he was going into the village to see his horse. Edward soon returned, commenting on the delightful beauty of the area. Marianne soon joined him in speaking of the natural charm of the hills and valleys nearby. Soon enough, Edward interrupted her. "Marianne, remember, I have dull opinions in comparison to your sensibilities and taste," he said, looking a bit angry. "You must be satisfied with my honest opinions of nature's beauty."
"I believe,"
said Elinor,
"Edward believes that many people pretend to feel more strongly about the beauties of nature than they truly feel. He becomes bored with such false emotions."
Marianne looked with surprise at Edward, and the subject was continued no further. Marianne remained silent till a new topic interested her. Soon after, when they were having tea, Marianne noticed a ring of hair around his finger, a present a lover would often give or a close relation.
"I never saw you wear a ring before, Edward,"
she cried.
"Is that Fanny's hair? I remember her promising to give you some, but I thought her hair was darker."
Edward looked quite embarrassed, and looked at Elinor quickly before replying, "Yes, it is my sister's hair. It must look lighter on my finger than it usually does." Elinor believed the hair to be her own, and felt satisfied, although she did not know how he had taken a piece of her hair, as she had never given a lock of her hair to him. Chapter 19. Edward stayed a week at the cottage. Elinor understood that Mrs. Ferrars, Edward's mother, was quite controlling of her son, and would not approve of a long visit to the Dashwoods, as she did not approve of a connection between Edward and Elinor. She was sure of his love for her, as she looked at the ring of hair around his finger. Immediately after Edward's departure, Elinor began occupying her time with painting and drawing. Marianne was astonished to see how calm her sister looked after Edward's leaving. One morning, as she sat drawing, she was interrupted by the arrival of the Middletons, Mrs. Jennings, and a mysterious couple. The guests came into the house, and the couple was introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Palmer. Mrs. Charlotte Palmer was Lady Middleton's sister, a pretty, cheerful young woman. She was several years younger than Lady Middleton, and very different from her sister. She was short and plump, with a pretty face. She certainly did not have the elegance of her sister, but she was a great deal more agreeable. She came in with a smile, smiled all the time of her visit. Her husband was a serious-looking man of 25 or 6, with more grace and fashion than his wife, but much less friendly. He entered the room, greeted the Dashwoods quickly before sitting down at the table to read his newspaper, and continued to read it as long as he stayed. The Middletons soon left with their guests to return to Barton Park. Upon their departure, Sir John requested that the Dashwoods come to Barton the next evening for dinner. Mrs. Dashwood refused, as she would not dine at the Middletons more than they dined at her home, which she considered only to be politeness. Sir John declared that they must come dine at Barton Park, as his guests would like their company, so the Dashwood women were required to go for dinner.
"The rent of this cottage is said to be low, but we certainly pay in other ways if we always have to dine at Barton Park whenever anyone is staying with either of them or with us. The Middletons only mean to be kind to us now,"
said Elinor. Chapter 20. The next day the Miss Dashwoods went for dinner at Barton Park, and were warmly greeted by Mrs. Palmer, looking merry as she ran to meet them. She immediately told them how delighted she was that they could see them, as she and her husband were to leave Barton the next day to visit their dear friends.
"I'm sorry we cannot stay longer. However, we shall meet again in London very soon, I hope."
The girls then informed her they would not be going to London very soon.
"Not going to London?"
cried Mrs. Palmer with a laugh.
"I shall be quite disappointed if you do not. You must come indeed. I shall be happy to take you around the city myself, at least before I give birth to my child in the spring."
The girls strongly but politely declined her offer to go for a visit. Later in the evening, Sir John, with a laugh, began asking Marianne if she had been walking near Willoughby's aunt's home. Marianne looked quite upset afterwards.
"Oh, don't be shy,"
said Mrs. Palmer.
"We know all about it. His home in the country Combe Magna in Somersetshire is near our country house as well. We know young Mr. Willoughby extremely well, although I have never spoken of him, but I have seen him in London many times."
Later in the evening, Mrs. Palmer went to sit with Elinor.
"When is your sister to marry Willoughby? I would be so glad to have your sister as a neighbour in Somersetshire." "My dear Mrs. Palmer, if you believe my sister is soon to be married, then you know more than I do,"
Elinor said, looking quite shocked.
"Don't pretend to deny it. Everyone talks of it. I met Colonel Brandon Monday morning in London, just before we left town, and he told me the news." "And how would Colonel Brandon know of such things?"
Elinor asked the merry young woman.
"Well, when I met him, I asked him about the new family in the new cottage, and told him I heard one of them was to marry Willoughby. When I told him what I had heard, he did not say much, but he looked as if he knew it to be true. It will be quite delightful. When is their wedding to take place?" "And how is Colonel Brandon?"
Elinor quickly asked, refusing to discuss Marianne's relationship with Willoughby any longer.
"Oh, he's quite well. He said many fine things about you." "He seems to be an excellent man."
Elinor was quite confused for the rest of the night after hearing such things from Mrs. Palmer about her sister's connection to Willoughby, which she knew very little about. Chapter 21. The Palmers returned to Cleveland, their home in Somersetshire, the next day. A few days after they had gone, however, Mrs. Jennings was taking a walk near by and met two young sisters, who she soon discovered were her distant relatives. When Sir John heard the news, he immediately invited the two young girls to come to Barton Park for dinner. Lady Middleton was quite upset that she would quickly be having guests, as she had no time to prepare her home and children for the grand look she always hoped to have. The young ladies arrived, and they looked quite fashionable with good manners. Lady Middleton soon became quite fond of the two sisters, as they were rather eager to compliment her home and children, which Lady Middleton loved to hear. She declared them to be very agreeable girls indeed. Sir John then went to the cottage to invite the Miss Dashwoods to meet the two Steele sisters. He declared that the two were the sweetest girls in the world, although Sir John said such things about most people he would meet. "Do come now," said he. "You must come. I declare you shall come. You will love the Steele girls. Lucy is quite pretty, and so friendly and agreeable. And both of the girls wish to meet the Dashwood women. You must come to meet them now." The Dashwoods politely declined the sudden invitation, promising to go for a visit within a day or two. When they did go for a visit to Barton Park, they discovered the older Steele sister, Anne, to be nearly 30 years old. She looked rather plain and dull, with somewhat impolite manners, which the Dashwoods soon discovered. However, Her younger sister, Lucy, was rather pretty, at 22 or 3 years old, and a great deal more clever and graceful than her sister. At the end of their visit, Elinor and Marianne had no desire to know the Steele sisters any further. The Steele girls wished to be considered highly by the Middletons, and therefore gave great compliments about the Dashwoods, insisting that they were certainly the most beautiful, elegant, and friendly girls they had ever met. Sir John hoped the Dashwood and Steele women to become excellent friends. Sir John believed that close friendships are easily formed through spending an hour together each day, no matter if their interests and characters are quite different. Sir John told the Steele girls all the information he knew about the Dashwoods, so a friendship between the girls might grow more quickly. He was quite delighted to tell them of Marianne's interest in Willoughby and Elinor's fondness of Edward Ferrars. Of course, the girls were not pleased that their private affairs were discovered by two women they hardly knew or respected. One evening, the Steele women were asking Marianne and Elinor about their secret love interests, but Sir John, delighted to be involved in any conversation, told the curious women the name of Elinor's love.
"Ferrars,"
repeated Miss Anne Steele.
"Mr. Ferrars is quite an agreeable man indeed. I know him very well." "How can you say so, Anne?"
cried Lucy.
"We have seen him once or twice at my uncle's. We do not know him very well."
Elinor was quite surprised to hear such news, but did not ask any questions about the matter. She was astonished to see how nervous Lucy Steele became after her sister declared them to know Edward well. Elinor suspected that the girls knew something more about Edward Ferrars, but nothing more was said. Chapter 22. During Lucy and Anne's stay with the Middletons, Elinor was the Dashwood sister responsible for showing friendly, proper behavior towards the guests. Lucy, in particular, showed great interest in talking with Elinor, and made conversation with her whenever possible. Elinor discovered that Lucy was, indeed, a rather amusing and clever girl, but realized that she knew nothing of books, art, and poetry, and rather pitied poor Lucy for it. One morning, the two girls were taking a walk together when Lucy admitted a great secret to Elinor, which she was not too willing to hear.
"Please allow me to ask you a rather odd question,"
said Lucy.
"But do you know Mrs. Ferrars quite well?" "No, I know nothing of her,"
Elinor replied after a moment's silence.
"I am sorry to be so impolite in asking such a question, but I feel that I can trust you. Therefore I must ask for some advice from you on how to manage the uncomfortable situation I am in. I am sorry you do not know Mrs. Ferrars." "I am sorry I do not,"
said Elinor in great astonishment.
"If it could help you to know my opinion of her,"
Elinor said, quite annoyed at Lucy's impolite questions.
"I never did understand how your two families were connected anyway. Therefore I'm a little surprised you are asking me about Mrs. Ferrars. I will tell you indeed. I do not well know her now, but I hope very soon to be closely connected with her,"
she said with a smile.
"Oh, my!"
cried Elinor.
"What do you mean? Do you know Mr. Robert Ferrars well?"
Elinor responded, rather bothered, thinking that the two might one day be sisters-in-law.
"No, not Mr. Robert Ferrars. I've never seen him,"
she said, looking carefully at Elinor.
"But his older brother."
Elinor looked at Lucy in complete astonishment, unable to say a word.
"Yes, you may be surprised,"
continued Lucy.
"As we have been engaged in secret. No one has known except my sister Anne and ourselves. I have no fear that you can keep this secret, as I know you are quite a trustworthy young woman."
After a moment's pause, Lucy continued to explain.
"We have been engaged for 4 years." 4 years? Yes, I did not know that you even knew him until the other day, when Sir John mentioned your family knows him. I have known him for several years. He was schooled at my uncle's home for quite some time." "Your uncle?" "Yes, Mr. Pratt. Did you ever hear Edward speak of Mr. Pratt?" "I think I have,"
replied Elinor, trying to hide her pain and disappointment.
"He lived with my uncle for 4 years near Plymouth. We met there, as my sister and I often stay with my uncle. I was quite unwilling to agree to marry him without first meeting his mother, but I was foolish and in love with him. You know as well as I do how easy it is to fall in love with him." "It is strange,"
said Elinor after a short silence,
"that he has never mentioned your name to me." "No, it is not strange,"
Lucy replied confidently.
"Our engagement is a secret. Therefore he must never speak of me to anyone. Miss Dashwood, what would you do if you were in my position?" "Pardon,"
replied Elinor, shocked by the question.
"I certainly cannot give you any advice. You must decide for yourself." "Poor Edward,"
continued Lucy.
"His mother is so controlling of him. We never are able to see each other more than once or twice a year. Did he seem quite upset when he came to visit you at Barton? He was so sad when he left us in Plymouth to go to you. I was afraid you would think he was ill." "Did he come from your uncle's when he visited us?" "Yes, he had been staying with us for 2 weeks, and he was so disturbed he had to leave."
After a long silence, Lucy took out a letter she had with her.
"Writing to each other is the only comfort we have in such long separations,"
she said, as she handed the letter to Elinor. Elinor was shocked to see that Edward had written the letter, but continued to hide her emotions from the impolite young Lucy.
"Perhaps you noticed the ring of hair around his finger?"
Lucy asked.
"I did,"
Elinor said, without looking at Lucy, who was smiling with satisfaction. At that moment they reached the cottage, and their conversation ended. Chapter 23. Elinor was, at first, quite angry with Edward, as she felt he had cheated her. He should not have remained at Norland after his feelings for her had turned to love. But after considering the situation further, Elinor realized that she pitied Edward more than all else. When she remembered that Edward had become engaged to Lucy at 19, she realized he was too young and foolish to understand the girl's true nature. After some time, he surely realized what a senseless girl she really is. As she considered these thoughts with a great deal of pain, she cried more for him than for herself. She knew that Edward truly loved her, but had already promised to marry Lucy, a selfish, shrewd girl he was no longer in love with. Chapter 24. A few days later, Sir John insisted that the Dashwood girls go to Barton Park for lunch, as Lady Middleton had only Lucy Steele and her sister to dine with. The girls politely agreed to go, although none were too happy to spend time with Lady Middleton and the ill-mannered Steele sisters. Elinor, in particular, was a bit nervous about seeing Lucy Steele again, since she had told Elinor her great secret. Lucy looked overjoyed to see Elinor, and immediately took her away from the group so they could speak in private. She had feared that Elinor was angry with her after she admitted her secret to her. Elinor politely assured her there was no reason to fear, as she promised to keep the secret.
"And yet I do assure you,"
Lucy said to her,
"you seemed quite cold to me the other day, which made me quite uncomfortable. I was certain that you were angry with me, but I am very glad to find that you do not really blame me. I feel so relieved that I am able to talk to someone about the secret engagement. It has been so worrisome to me." "I can easily believe it was a great relief to you. Your situation is unfortunate, as Mr. Ferrars, I believe, is entirely dependent on his mother." "He has only £2,000 himself. The rest he receives from his mother, and I fear that if he marries me without his mother's approval, he shall receive no more, as Mrs. Ferrars would rather give all her fortune to Robert out of anger."
Lucy explained.
"Yes, it is a difficult situation. But what is your plan for the future regarding Mrs. Ferrars?"
Elinor asked, sincerely interested in the subject.
"I know Mrs. Ferrars is a proud woman. Therefore I do not plan to marry hurriedly. I know that Edward would prefer becoming a minister in the church to any other employment. Now, my plan is that he should find employment as quickly as possible. Then I would appreciate your help."
Lucy said before pausing,
"I was wishing you could speak to your brother about employing Edward at Norland as a minister. I have heard a minister's income there is quite good." "Mr. Ferrars' own sister, Mrs. John Dashwood, would be more of an influence on my brother's decision to employ him,"
Elinor said, trying to hide her great annoyance at such a disrespectful request.
"But Mrs. John Dashwood would not approve of Edward becoming a minister." "Then I believe my help would not assist you either,"
Elinor said coldly.
"Oh, Miss Dashwood, you must give me advice on this troubling matter. I honour your advice above everyone else's. You are an indifferent person,"
said Lucy, looking carefully at Elinor after making such a hurtful remark. Elinor made no answer. The Steele sisters stayed at Barton Park far longer than they originally planned. Lucy attempted to speak with Elinor of her engagement at any moment possible, and always happily informed Elinor of a letter arriving from Edward. Elinor received such information with calm alertness, refusing to let Lucy see her pain. Chapter 25. Though Mrs. Jennings often stayed with her children and friends during the majority of the year, she did have a home of her own in London. She announced that she planned to leave near the end of January, and invited Elinor and Marianne to go along. The Middletons would, as well, join her in London at their home in town. Elinor supposed that Marianne would not wish to go, as she rather disliked Mrs. Jennings's impolite manners. However, Marianne was overjoyed with the idea of going, as she would perhaps have many opportunities to see her beloved Willoughby.
"I am delighted with the plan,"
cried their mother.
"It is exactly what I could wish for. You will find Margaret so improved when you come back again, and you will probably see your brother, and whatever may be his faults, or the faults of his wife, he is still your brother, and you should see him occasionally. And perhaps,"
Mrs. Dashwood continued, looking at Elinor with a smile,
"you will become closer with your sister-in-law's family."
Elinor was pained to hear such words, as she had tried for quite some time to show little interest in Edward, but could not tell her family of his great secret. The Dashwood girls formally accepted Mrs. Jennings' invitation. The Miss Steeles, especially Lucy, looked as if they had never been so happy in their lives after hearing that Elinor and Marianne would be going to London as well. Elinor was not too pleased with the idea of seeing the Steele sisters in London, but she was content to see her sister in complete happiness in going to London. Marianne's only worry was in leaving her mother. Mrs. Dashwood's anxiety at Elinor and Marianne's departure was felt as well. When they parted, Elinor was the only one of the three who seemed not to consider the separation as eternal. Their departure took place in the first week of January. The Middletons were to follow in about a week. The Miss Steeles were to travel with their cousins shortly after. Chapter 26. After a long 3-day journey, they arrived in London. The girls were quite pleased with Mrs. Jennings' home, which was quite handsome and large. As dinner would not be served for 2 hours after their arrival, Elinor immediately sat down to write to her mother. In a few moments, Marianne sat down to write as well.
"I am writing home, Marianne,"
said Elinor.
"It would be better if you wrote in a day or two." "I'm not going to write, my mother,"
replied Marianne hurriedly. Elinor said no more, as she realized Marianne was writing to Willoughby. She was surprised at the secrecy of Marianne's letter, and supposed the two were indeed engaged. Marianne was rather upset all evening, intent on listening to each carriage pass by the door, hoping each one was Willoughby coming to see her. Finally, late in the evening, someone came to the door.
"Oh, Elinor, it is Willoughby. I know it is,"
she exclaimed, just as Colonel Brandon appeared. Marianne was too shocked to be polite, and immediately left the room. Colonel Brandon saw her leave, knowing he had caused such pain. However, he tried not to show his suffering. "Is your sister ill?" he asked. Elinor replied politely that Marianne was feeling a bit tired after the long journey. Elinor was disappointed that Willoughby had not come, but she was pleased to see Colonel Brandon, as she regarded him as a dear friend. For the next few days, Marianne was nervously checking the mail and waiting near the door, hoping Willoughby would soon come. He, unfortunately, did not come. Chapter 27. Colonel Brandon visited them nearly every day. He came to look at Marianne and talk to Elinor, who was always quite pleased to make conversation with him, but was also worried to see him watch her sister with such love. About a week after their arrival, the girls returned late in the morning with Mrs. Jennings after visiting friends. Marianne quickly noticed that Willoughby had, during their outing, come for a visit.
"Good God!"
cried Marianne.
"He has been here while we were out."
Elinor was delighted to see that Willoughby was indeed in London again.
"Marianne, he will surely come again tomorrow for a visit,"
she told her sister. Elinor was content that he had come, and Marianne's confidence in Willoughby's love for herself had returned. The next morning, Marianne insisted on staying home while the others went out, hoping Willoughby would return. Later in the day, a letter was brought to the house. Marianne took it immediately, supposing it was from Willoughby. Unfortunately, it was a letter for Mrs. Jennings from Lady Middleton, announcing that their family had arrived the night before in London. Lady Middleton wished for them to go for a visit the next evening, which they agreed to. Sir John, in the 2 days since he arrived in town, managed to invite 20 young people over for a dinner party and dance. Lady Middleton was rather bothered, as such unprepared parties were acceptable in the country, but events in London must be planned, as she must continue to be considered elegant and high class. Marianne was rather annoyed to have to be at the party without her Willoughby. She became more upset after discovering that Sir John had seen Willoughby and invited him to the gathering. Willoughby, however, had politely refused. The next morning, Elinor decided that she must write to her mother to explain the situation. In the letter, she begged her mother to demand that Marianne tell her the true situation with Willoughby. After finishing the letter, Colonel Brandon arrived for a visit. Marianne saw him coming from the window and left the room. "Your sister looks unwell today," he began. After a pause, he continued, congratulating her on gaining a brother. Elinor was shocked and confused. He tried to smile as he spoke. "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is well known by all."
"It cannot be well known. I do not even know."
He looked surprised and said, "I'm sorry. My comment was quite impolite. But I did not believe there was any secret, as their marriage is often spoken of. Mrs. Jennings, the Middletons, and the Palmers all speak of it. Mrs. Jennings' own servant was talking about it, as she often delivers letters to Willoughby from your sister." Elinor was silent, shocked that Colonel Brandon knew more about her sister's love affair than herself. She saw how painful this visit was for Colonel Brandon, as he would now never succeed in winning Marianne's love. "I wish your sister all the happiness in the world, and wish for Willoughby to one day deserve her love," he said before quickly leaving. Elinor was quite upset after such a meeting with the colonel. She pitied him for his pain and suffering, though she knew Marianne would be delighted to hear such news. Chapter 28. For the next 3 or 4 days, Marianne heard nothing from Willoughby. He did not write, nor did he come for a visit. Soon enough, Lady Middleton requested that the 2 girls attend a party with her. Marianne was indifferent about all activities, and therefore cared little about her appearance during the event. Upon arriving, she sat quietly, refusing to speak to anyone. The 2 girls had been sitting down for a short time when Elinor saw Willoughby, standing nearby, talking to a very fashionable-looking young woman. Willoughby then looked over, Elinor smiled, and he greeted her with a smile as well, although he did not come to speak to her or Marianne. Elinor then turned to Marianne to see whether she had noticed him as well. At that moment, Marianne looked suddenly delighted, and would have gone to him immediately if her sister had not stopped her.
"He is there! He is there! Why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?"
she exclaimed. At last Willoughby came to them, but refused to look at Marianne, speaking only to Elinor. He hurriedly asked about Mrs. Dashwood and their sister. After a few moments, however, Marianne, growing more upset, began to speak.
"Good God, Willoughby, what is the matter? Have you not received my letters? Why are you not speaking to me?"
He could no longer avoid looking at her. He turned to her, looking quite nervous, but spoke in a rather calm manner. "Yes, I did receive your notes informing me that you had arrived in town. I did go for a visit, but unfortunately you were out."
"Willoughby, tell me what is the matter with you?"
He did not reply, but looked quite embarrassed as he noticed the young woman he was speaking to earlier. "Yes, thank you for informing me that you have arrived in town," he said before hurriedly turning away. Marianne now looked rather pale, and sat in her chair looking discouraged. Willoughby soon left the party, and Elinor was relieved for her sister. Marianne desired to leave immediately, so Elinor informed Lady Middleton that Marianne was quite ill. They then returned home, and Marianne went to her room immediately, wishing only to be alone. Chapter 29. Early the next morning, Elinor went to Marianne's room to see her. Marianne was occupied writing a long letter, crying as she wrote.
"Marianne, may I ask—" "No, Elinor,"
she replied.
"You will soon know all."
Elinor saw her sister's desperate calmness, and knew that this was the last time she would be writing to Willoughby. At breakfast, Marianne sat silently in her chair, refusing to eat anything. As this was Mrs. Jennings' favorite meal of the day, it lasted for quite a long time. Toward the end of breakfast, a letter was brought in for Marianne. She looked at the envelope, turned pale, and immediately left the room.
"My goodness,"
said Mrs. Jennings.
"I have never seen a young woman so desperately in love in my life. My girls were nothing like her. I sincerely hope that he marries her soon. It is quite upsetting to see her look so ill and upset. When are they to be married?" "And you really believe they will soon be married?"
Elinor asked, quite bothered.
"I thought it had been only a joke, but your question is quite serious. I do hope you will stop with these questions, as my sister has no plans to marry Mr. Willoughby. You are mistaken, and you are quite unkind to declare such false reports, though you will not believe me now."
Mrs. Jennings laughed, but Elinor said nothing more. She soon hurried away to see Marianne. As she opened the door, she saw Marianne sitting on the bed, crying over the letter she had just received. Elinor gently kissed her hand. Marianne then handed her the letter to read. "My dear Madam, I have just received your letter. I do apologize if my behavior last night did upset you, though I am rather confused as to how I did upset you. I must assure you I did not intend to anger you. I do greatly respect your family, and have fond memories of the time I spent with you all. Please, however, do not believe my feelings of friendship toward your family were more. You must understand that I felt nothing more for you, as my love has been given to someone else. I have been engaged for nearly 3 weeks. I have, as well, enclosed your letters and your lock of hair. Sincerely, John Willoughby." Elinor became quite angry in reading such a disrespectful letter. He used such hurtful words to declare that he was not in love with Marianne, and was quite dishonorable in announcing his engagement. Elinor had supposed him to be a gentleman, but his letter showed that he was simply cruel and selfish.
"Oh, Elinor, happy Elinor, you cannot know how I suffer. You have no sorrow." "Do you call me happy, Marianne?" "If you knew. And can you believe me to be happy while I see you in such sadness?" Forgive me,"
Marianne exclaimed.
"I know you feel for me. I know you have a good heart. But you must be happy. Edward loves you. What can end such love?" "Many, many factors." "No, he loves you and only you. You have no pain. I have no happiness." "What about your engagement to him? Surely he would not leave you now." "Engagement? What engagement?"
cried Marianne.
"There has been no engagement. We were never engaged." "No engagement?" "No. You see, he has not broken a promise to me,"
said Marianne quietly.
"But he told you that he loved you?" "Yes, no, he never actually said the words, but I knew he did love me." "But you wrote to him?" "Yes, that was not wrong after the love we felt at Barton Park."
Elinor said no more, and quickly turned to the 3 other letters beside Marianne.
"How surprised you will be, Willoughby, on receiving this. I am now in London, staying with Mrs. Jennings. I hope you receive this letter in time to come visit tonight, as I look forward to seeing you. If you do not come tonight, I shall expect you to come tomorrow. For now, good-bye, M.D."
Her second note, which had been written on the morning after the dance at the Middletons, was in these words:
"I cannot express my disappointment in having missed you the day before yesterday. I am quite surprised I have not yet received any answer to the note which I sent to you more than a week ago. I have been expecting to hear from you, and wish to see you. Please come again as soon as possible, and explain why you have not yet come. We were last night at Lady Middleton's, where there was a dance. I have been told that you were invited to the party, but is it true? You must have been ill not to come. I hope very soon to see you. M.D.
The contents of her last note to him were these.
What am I to imagine, Willoughby, by your behaviour last night? Again I demand an explanation for it. I was prepared to meet you with pleasure. I was quite disappointed in your behaviour indeed. I am ready to hear your apology. Perhaps you have been misinformed in something concerning me, which has lowered me in your opinion. Tell me what it is. Explain your behaviour last night, and I shall forgive you. I would be quite upset to have to think of you as insincere. I am rather confused, and wish to forgive you for such impoliteness. If your feelings are not what they were in the past, please return my notes and the lock of my hair that you have. M.D.
Reading Marianne's letters, full of joy and love, upset Elinor all the more. She could not understand Willoughby's reasons for treating Marianne with such cold-hearted disrespect.
Oh, Elinor, I know he was in love with me, as I was with him. He begged me for that lock of hair. I know he loved me, but I do not blame him. The world has cheated us. I know he would not have hurt me. I know his heart too well. Who is this woman that he speaks of? He never spoke of her before. He only spoke of me. We were in love. I know we were.
After a pause, she continued,
Elinor, I must go home. I must go and comfort Mamma. Can we leave tomorrow? Tomorrow, Marianne? Yes, I cannot bear to stay here any longer. I came only to see Willoughby, and now who cares for me? It would be impossible to go tomorrow. Mrs. Jennings would be greatly upset if we left tomorrow. Well, then, another day or two, perhaps. But I cannot stay here long. I cannot bear the questions and remarks of all these people. The pity of such a woman as Lady Middleton. Oh, what would she say to that?
Chapter 30. Mrs. Jennings came immediately to their room after her return.
How are you, my dear? She
said, in a voice of great tenderness.
How is she, Miss Dashwood? Poor thing, she looks very bad. Ah, so it's true. He is to be married very soon, that cheat. I have no respect for him. I just heard from a friend of Miss Grey's. If I ever meet him again, I will not treat him with any kindness. He is no longer considered a friend of mine.
She then went away, leaving the two girls alone again. Later in the evening, Elinor was sitting with Mrs. Jennings while Marianne was resting in her room.
This lady, Miss Grey, is she very rich? 50,000 pounds, my dear. Have you ever seen her? She's a stylish girl, but not beautiful. I have heard young Willoughby has spent almost all his fortune, so he'll certainly need her large income. I do hope,
said Elinor carefully,
you will advise the Palmers and Sir John not to mention Mr. Willoughby's name in Marianne's presence. It would be quite cruel to do so. Oh, of course, you must not worry. They'll never mention his name before her.
The next afternoon, Colonel Brandon came for a visit, although Marianne was resting in her room, not interested in meeting anyone other than her sister. He had heard of Mr. Willoughby's engagement to Miss Grey, and came to find out how Marianne was handling the heartbreaking news. Although he was most likely overjoyed that Marianne would not soon be married, he did look like he suffered greatly, knowing that his dear Marianne was so greatly upset. Chapter 31. Marianne had slept better than she supposed she would. Her sister encouraged her to speak freely about her heartache. One moment she could believe Willoughby was as unfortunate and innocent as herself, but soon she blamed him for treating her so terribly. Soon enough, Mrs. Jennings came to greet them, but Marianne said very little to her.
"Her kindness is false,"
Marianne said after the old woman left the room.
"Her friendliness is not tenderness. All she wants is a good story to tell her friends, and she only likes me now because I give her such stories."
Soon after, Mrs. Jennings returned with a letter in her hand, smiling as she came in.
"Now, my dear, I bring you something I'm sure will help you."
Marianne then supposed with joy that the letter was from Willoughby, full of tenderness and regret for having treated her so terribly. But she was mistaken. The letter was from her mother. Never till that moment had a letter from her mother caused her disappointment. A moment later, however, she was quite pleased to read the loving message that her mother sent her. Some time later, Mrs. Jennings left the house to visit her daughters. Just after she left, a visitor arrived. Marianne looked out the window.
"It's Colonel Brandon,"
said she, annoyed.
"We are never safe from him,"
she said before she left the room. He came into the room and greeted Elinor nervously. "I met Mrs. Jennings as I was walking down the street, and she encouraged me to come over. I was hoping to find you alone, as I must discuss something with you, Miss Dashwood."
"I understand you,"
said Elinor.
"You have something to tell me of Mr. Willoughby that will explain his odd behavior."
"You, of course, remember in October when I left Barton suddenly to return to London? Well, I must explain more. Where to begin?" He stopped for a moment before continuing. "I once told you that Marianne reminded me of a young woman I once knew. Do you remember?"
"Indeed,"
answered Elinor.
"I have not forgotten."
He looked pleased that she remembered. "This young woman was quite eager and had a tender heart, just like your sister. This lady was one of my dearest friends, an orphan from childhood. Her parents had died when she was very young. Therefore, my father cared for her after her parents' deaths. We were nearly the same age, and were dear friends from our earliest years. At 17, she was forced to marry my brother, although that was not her wish, as we were in love. My brother did not deserve her. He did not even love her. Her situation was terrible, and we decided we would run away together. Her maid, however, told my father of our plans, and we were not permitted to leave. She was then married to my brother, and he treated her horribly. During this time, I was sent to India to serve in the military. Had I remained in England, perhaps I could have saved her, but I left England so they could attempt to have a happy life together as a married couple. 2 years after they were married, however, I heard of her divorce. I suffered greatly after hearing such news." He stopped for a few moments, looking rather upset. "It was nearly 3 years after this unhappy time before I returned to England. When I first arrived, I looked for her, but could find her nowhere. I later discovered that she had gone away with a lover. After her divorce, she was given very little money, although she had had a great fortune of her own before she was married. Nearly 6 months after arriving in England, I found out she was being held in a debtor's prison. I immediately went to rescue her. She was no longer the same beautiful girl I had been in love with. She was now faded and ill, suffering greatly. She was in the last months of her life. I could do nothing more for her, but ease her pain before her death and care for her daughter, which she had with her lover. After Eliza's death, I was to take care of her child of nearly 3 years old. Eliza loved that child and had always kept it with her. I was glad to care for the child, but could not care for her alone, as people might wonder that the child was my own, as I had no family and no home to take her to. My little Eliza was therefore placed in school. I saw her there whenever I could, and after the death of my brother, which happened about 5 years ago, I was given the family property, where she frequently came to visit me. I told people she was a distant cousin, but I know many people think her to be my own child. 3 years ago, she had just turned 14, I removed her from school to place her under the care of a very respectable woman living near my home, who had 4 or 5 other girls to care for as well. I was quite pleased with her situation, as she was well taken care of. But last February, almost 1 year ago, she suddenly disappeared. I had allowed her, foolishly, to go to Bath with one of her young friends, who was visiting her father there. I knew him to be a good man, and thought well of his daughter, but later found that she was not such an honest girl. When Eliza disappeared, her friend gave me no information as to where she had gone. For the next 8 long months I feared the worst things had happened to my dear Eliza, and I greatly suffered.
"Oh, no!"
cried Elinor.
"Could it be? Could Willoughby—"
The first news that reached me of her, he continued, came in a letter from herself last October. I received it on the very morning of our intended picnic, and this was my reason for leaving Barton so suddenly. Mr. Willoughby did not know that while he was calling me impolite for leaving the party, I was going to relieve someone whom he had made poor and miserable. But if he had known it, he would not have felt any guilt. He had begun a love affair with my innocent Eliza, after which she was soon with child. He left her, taking her youth and innocence, promising to return. He neither returned, nor wrote, nor helped her in any way.
"This is unbelievable!"
exclaimed Elinor. "You now know his true character, the worst kind. I have known this information for many weeks, and it has pained me to see your sister so upset over such a dishonest young man. When I came to visit you last week, I planned to find out the true situation between your sister and Willoughby. You must have thought my behavior to be quite strange, as I suffered greatly knowing you all to be cheated by Willoughby. But what could I do? I certainly could not explain the situation to your sister. But now your sister must remember that, although Willoughby cheated her, she should be thankful that she was not cheated as my dear Eliza was. She is now in a hopeless situation, and will now never be able to marry and live well, as your sister still might." Elinor was grateful to Colonel Brandon for such important information. She promised to immediately explain the situation to Marianne, hoping to relieve some of her pain.
"Have you seen Mr. Willoughby since you left Barton?"
Elinor asked after a short silence. "Yes," he replied sadly. "Eliza admitted to me the name of her lover. When he returned to town nearly 2 weeks after I came back, I was forced to meet him once to discuss the harm he had caused Eliza. He apologized, and I punished him. So the lives of mother and daughter are quite similar, and I have failed them both in my promise to care for young Eliza."
"Is she still in London?"
"No. As soon as she had her child, I took them into the country, and there she remains." He then remembered that he was probably keeping Elinor away from her sister, so he said good-bye and left. Elinor respected him a great deal more for all he had told her. Chapter 32. Elinor soon told her sister the shocking story. Marianne listened silently, at times unable to believe what she was hearing. After some time, however, Marianne accepted the story to be true, but she did not feel better after discovering Willoughby's true character. Marianne no longer avoided meeting Colonel Brandon, and now spoke to him with respect and tenderness. Mrs. Dashwood immediately sent a letter to comfort her daughter. Her mother believed that perhaps staying in London might be better for her suffering daughter, as she had many friends there, as well as several more activities to take part in than in the country. Although such a suggestion greatly pained her, as she sincerely wished to see her daughters and to comfort Marianne. After the Middletons and the Palmers discovered the news of Willoughby's engagement to Miss Grey, they were all quite shocked and disappointed in his behavior. Sir John declared that he would no longer invite the young man along for hunting outings, though he was one of the best riders in England, or so John believed. Lady Middleton showed her astonishment by remarking nearly twice a day what a shock the news was. However, she had discovered that Miss Grey was quite an elegant, high-class woman, just as she was, and decided to know her better after she was married to Willoughby. Mrs. Palmer was just as angry as her mother, and promised that she would tell everyone she met what a cheating young man he was. She wished as well that her country home were not near his. Early in February, within 2 weeks from receiving Willoughby's letter, Elinor was forced to tell her sister that Willoughby was indeed married. At first, Marianne said nothing and did not look disturbed after hearing the news. After a short time, however, she burst into tears. Elinor knew that she had to tell Marianne, although it would cause her a great deal of pain, as finding out another way would be more painful. The Willoughbys left London immediately after their wedding, which greatly relieved Elinor, as she would no longer have to worry about Marianne seeing him while in town. About this time, the two Miss Steeles arrived at their cousin's home. Elinor was sorry to see them. Their presence always gave her pain.
"I'm surprised to find you in town still,"
Lucy said, referring to Marianne's surprising meeting with Willoughby. She supposed the Dashwoods would leave immediately after Marianne discovered that Willoughby was engaged to another. Elinor disregarded Lucy's rude comment, however.
"We travelled with quite a handsome man, Dr. Davies. He certainly behaved like a gentleman,"
her sister said with a smile.
"Oh,"
cried Mrs. Jennings.
"the doctor is a single man, you should remember. Oh, everyone laughs at me about the doctor, but I do not know why. My cousins say the doctor is interested in me, but I do not believe so."
Miss Anne Steele said, enjoying the attention.
"How charming that Mrs. Dashwood has allowed you to be gone for so long time,"
Lucy said to Elinor.
"Long time indeed,"
interrupted Mrs. Jennings.
"Their visit is just beginning."
Lucy was silenced.
"I'm sorry we cannot see your sister, Miss Dashwood,"
said Miss Anne Steele.
"I am sorry she is not well."
Marianne had left the room as they arrived.
"Thank you. I'm sure my sister is upset she cannot see you both as well. She has been rather ill lately and must rest." "Oh dear, what a pity. We are such good friends. I think she might see us. Perhaps we could go into her room for a minute and greet her. Let us go in for just a moment to see her,"
insisted Miss Steele. Elinor was surprised at such an impolite request, and again politely declined. Chapter 33. One morning, Elinor persuaded her sister to take a walk outside, as she had not been outside Mrs. Jennings for nearly 2 weeks. As they were walking, they came upon their brother, John Dashwood. He was rather happy to see them, and mentioned that he had intended to visit them after arriving in town, but had been quite busy. Elinor soon discovered that he and Fanny had been in town for 2 days. "I have heard that you are here with a woman of very good fortune. And the Middletons, too. You must introduce me to them as well."
"Excellent indeed. Their attention to our comfort, their friendliness, is more than I hoped for."
Her brother promised to go for a visit the next day, and did come, though Mrs. John Dashwood did not join him. He was quite polite to Mrs. Jennings, and even more so to Colonel Brandon, who was there for a visit as well. After staying with them half an hour, he asked Elinor to walk with him to the Middletons' home for an introduction. Just after they left Mrs. Jennings' home, he began with several questions. "Who is Colonel Brandon? Is he a man of fortune?"
"Yes, he is."
"I am happy for that." "He seems to be an excellent gentleman." "Congratulations, Elinor, on an excellent match."
"Me? What do you mean?"
"He likes you. I saw him watching you." "What is the amount of his fortune?"
"I believe about £2,000 a year."
2,000 a year? That's excellent. I wish you good fortune, Elinor."
"I'm very sure that Colonel Brandon does not wish to marry me."
"You should try to win him, Elinor. Fanny is very concerned for you. She wishes for you to be well married, and her mother does as well." Elinor refused to answer. It would be wonderful if Fanny had a brother and I a sister who were married at the same time.
"Is Mr. Edward Ferrars,
said Elinor, trying to be calm.
going to be married?"
"His excellent mother, Mrs. Ferrars, has agreed to give him £1,000 a year if he will marry the Honourable Miss Morton with a fortune of £30,000. She is quite a generous woman. When we arrived, she gave Fanny a present of £200, as she knows how difficult and expensive it is for us here in town." He paused for her pity.
"Your expenses both in town and the country are large, but so is your income."
"Not so large as many people believe it to be. Our father, at his death, gave many valuables to your mother, which we have had to replace since you four left Norland. Such purchases have been quite expensive." Elinor had to smile, but could say nothing. After explaining how poor he now was, he became more cheerful and spoke again. "Mrs. Jennings seems to be quite a valuable friend for you. Perhaps she will leave you and our sisters a fortune when she dies."
"I believe she would not leave us anything. She has no reason to leave us anything. Of course she will leave the rest of her fortune to her children, rather than 3 young girls she has not long known."
They soon arrived at the Middletons for a short visit. Elinor knew that her brother felt guilty in not fulfilling his promise to their father to take care of his sisters and their mother. He hoped that his sisters would soon marry wealthy husbands, so he would no longer have to feel such guilt. After their visit, Mr. John Dashwood was delighted with his new friends and promised to bring Fanny along for the next visit, as he knew she would take an interest in Lady Middleton. Chapter 34. A few evenings after this visit, Mr. and Mrs. Dashwood announced that they would be having a dinner party. The guests were to include John Dashwood's sisters, Mrs. Jennings, the Steele sisters, Colonel Brandon, and the Middletons. Elinor soon discovered that Mrs. Ferrars would attend the party as well. She worried about how to manage seeing Edward in the same room with Lucy Steele. She was not looking forward to the event, but did not speak to anyone about her worries. Lucy came to speak to her in private about her own anxieties of meeting Mrs. Ferrars.
"Pity me, dear Miss Dashwood,"
she said, as they walked up the stairs to the party.
"There is nobody here but you who can understand my feelings right now. In a moment I shall see the person that all my happiness depends on, that is to be my mother."
Elinor could have eased her worries in suggesting that they were soon to see Miss Morton's future mother-in-law, but she instead pitied her. Lucy was quite surprised at such tenderness, as she had hoped to be greatly envied by Elinor. During the party, Mrs. Ferrars and her daughter were nothing but impolite to poor Elinor, although she no longer felt the pain on receiving such rude looks. She instead was quite amused, as she understood that if they knew of Lucy's secret, she would no longer be hated. As Mrs. Ferrars and her daughter did not know of Lucy's secret, they treated her quite well. Lucy felt quite honored, and her sister wanted only to be teased about Dr. Davies to be perfectly happy. Chapter 35. Elinor's curiosity to see Mrs. Ferrars was satisfied. She discovered, just as she had suspected, that Mrs. Ferrars was a proud, angry old woman, and would have caused many problems for her and Edward, if they had indeed become engaged. That morning, after Mrs. Jennings went out for visits, Lucy came to see Elinor to show her satisfaction in Mrs. Ferrars' behavior towards herself during the dinner party the night before. Elinor was quite surprised that Lucy could be so pleased with Mrs. Ferrars' attitude towards her, as Elinor believed it to be quite obvious that Mrs. Ferrars giving Lucy and her sister such tender attention was only to hurt Elinor.
"My dear friend,"
cried Lucy,
"I came to talk of my happiness. I was so worried to see Mrs. Ferrars, but she was so interested in talking with me. I knew she was quite fond of me. She was not kinder to anyone else than she was to me. She is such a charming woman, and so is your sister, Mrs. John Dashwood. They are both delightful women indeed. You have never before told me how charming your sister is. Now Edward and I will be able to meet often, for Lady Middleton was quite fond of Mrs. Dashwood, so I believe we will all spend a great deal of time together. I am sure if you tell your sister, Mrs. John Dashwood, that I think she's a charming woman, you will not speak too highly."
but Elinor would not tell her sister-in-law what Lucy thought of her, as Lucy hoped she would.
"Yes, Mrs. Ferrars is quite delighted with me from the beginning of the night, and I know that when she does not dislike someone, her dislike is great."
Elinor did not respond to this comment, intended to hurt her. At that moment, however, Mr. Edward Ferrars came into the room. It was quite an awkward moment for the three, particularly since there was no one else in the room, which made them look rather foolish. Lucy had never told Edward she had informed Elinor of their engagement, and therefore greeted him politely before sitting down, refusing to say a word. Since Edward did not know Elinor knew of his secret engagement, Lucy could not speak to him with tenderness, and could only look her tenderness. But Elinor had to do more. She would not let Lucy's presence force her to hide her joy in seeing Edward, and she greeted him with warmth and joy. After a few moments with him, she left to inform Marianne that Edward had arrived. She waited in the hall for a few minutes, so Edward and Lucy would have a short time to be together. When she told Marianne of Edward's arrival, she immediately went to him, eager to see him.
"Dear Edward,"
she cried,
"this is a moment of great happiness."
During Edward's short visit, Marianne insisted that he return to Barton with them to visit Mrs. Dashwood. Edward, of course, politely declined, which greatly satisfied Lucy, but Marianne was quite confused at his refusing her invitation. Soon enough, however, he left them. Soon after, Lucy left as well.
"What can bring her here so often?"
asked Marianne after she had left.
"Could she not see that we wanted her gone? Poor Edward!"
Elinor did not say anything, however, as she knew she could not tell her sister of Lucy's great secret. Chapter 36. Within a few days after this meeting, Mrs. Palmer delivered her first child, Thomas Palmer. Mrs. Jennings was in perfect happiness and went to see her daughter Charlotte every morning after the birth, and did not return till late in the evening. Therefore, the Miss Dashwoods would spend a great part of their days at the Middletons, although they would have preferred to remain at Mrs. Jennings' home. But everyone wished for them to spend time with friends. Their time was spent with Lady Middleton and the two Miss Steeles, two girls who they were never pleased to see. Lady Middleton did not particularly like the two Dashwood girls, as they never complimented herself or her children. Therefore she thought the girls to be rather ill-mannered. One evening, Elinor and Marianne were invited to a dinner party with their sister-in-law, Mrs. John Dashwood. The lady having the party supposed the two Dashwood girls were staying with their brother and sister, given that they were related, so the invitations were all sent to the home of Mr. John Dashwood. Therefore, Mrs. Dashwood was forced to take her sisters to the party in her own carriage, which greatly annoyed her. During the party, Elinor was introduced to Mr. Robert Ferrars, rather a selfish fool, quite different from his honest and sincere brother. After the party, John Dashwood suggested to his wife that they invite his two sisters to stay with them, after the hostess of the party had mistakenly supposed Elinor and Marianne to be guests of their brother and his wife. Fanny was shocked at the idea.
"I do not see how it can be done,"
said she,
"without upsetting Lady Middleton, as they spend every day with her. Otherwise, I would be quite glad to invite your sisters. Right now, however, they are guests of Lady Middleton."
"But they have already spent a week visiting her every day, and Lady Middleton could not be displeased with my sisters spending a week with their brother and sister." Fanny paused for a moment, then began.
"My love, I would ask them if I could, but I just asked the Miss Steeles to spend a few days with us. They are very well-behaved, good girls, and I think we should know them better. We can ask your sisters some other year. But the Miss Steeles may not be in town any more. I'm sure you will like them."
Mr. Dashwood was persuaded. He saw that it was necessary to invite the Miss Steeles immediately, and planned to invite his sisters another year. He secretly hoped that Elinor would come to town as Colonel Brandon's wife, and Marianne as their visitor, so he would not have to pay for their time in town with his own money. Fanny was proud of herself. Now she would not have to invite her sisters, who she certainly was not fond of. The next day she sent a note inviting the Miss Steeles, and they happily accepted the invitation. Soon enough, Mrs. John Dashwood was quite pleased at inviting the two girls, as they quickly became good friends. Chapter 37. Mrs. Palmer was so well after 2 weeks that her mother no longer felt it necessary to stay all day with her daughter. One evening, Mrs. Jennings returned home from visiting her daughter, eager to tell the two Dashwood girls of the news she had just received. Mrs. Palmer's doctor was visiting the child, as it had recently become ill. During his visit, Mrs. Jennings asked if he had seen Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood recently. The doctor smiled, explaining that he had seen them the night before. During the previous night, while the Steele sisters were enjoying their stay at the Dashwoods, Anne Steele accidentally mentioned her sister's engagement to Mrs. Dashwood. Fanny then began screaming at the two girls, insisting that they leave immediately. She became so upset that the doctor was called to calm her. The Steele girls were ordered to leave immediately and went to stay with another cousin in town. Mrs. Jennings greatly pitied Edward, who now would receive nothing from his mother and would be forced to marry with no fortune. After Mrs. Jennings had finished, Elinor took her sister into their room to explain how she had known of the engagement. Marianne was shocked and felt a great amount of guilt for insisting that Elinor was happy while she herself suffered.
"How long has this been known to you, Elinor?" "I have known these 4 months. When Lucy first came to Barton Park last November, she told me of her engagement. At first, of course, I was upset, but it has been a long time, and I can now speak of it with little emotion." 4 4 months!"
cried Marianne.
"So calm, so cheerful. You cared for me while I suffered, and I was angry with you for being happy. I have treated you terribly."
Elinor was touched that her sister was so upset, and assured her that she was no longer in pain. The next morning their brother came to see them. "Your sister Fanny," he said, "has suffered terribly. Mrs. Ferrars, too. Poor Fanny! She was crying all day. Yesterday Mrs. Ferrars met with Edward. She insisted that he end his engagement, but he refused. I did not know he could be so unfeeling. His mother offered him a great fortune if he would end his engagement, but he continued to refuse. Therefore, she told him that he would only have 2,000 pounds, and she would no longer consider him her son. He left her house yesterday, but we do not know where he has gone."
"Poor young man! What will happen to him?"
asked Mrs. Jennings sincerely. "Yes, it is upsetting. He would have been so wealthy if he had married Miss Morton, as she has a great fortune herself, and Edward's mother would have given him a great deal as well. Now, however, Mrs. Ferrars plans to give a large amount of money and land to his younger brother Robert." Mr. John Dashwood stayed for a short time before leaving to see his wife, who was suffering terribly, he explained. Chapter 38. Mrs. Jennings was quite impressed with Edward's behavior and spoke of him often. One day, Mrs. Jennings and Elinor took a walk to the park. Marianne refused to go, as she knew the Willoughbys had recently returned to London, and feared she might one day see them. Therefore, she rarely went out. While out, Elinor and Mrs. Jennings met Miss Anne Steele, who was delighted to see them. She took Elinor away from the group to speak in private, smiling and holding her arm as if they were dear friends.
"I have never seen Lucy so angry in my life. I thought she would never speak to me after I told the Dashwoods of her engagement to Edward. She has forgiven me, however, and we are closer than ever before. Well, Miss Dashwood, we were quite worried for the first few days after the Dashwoods found out, as they did not hear from Edward during that time. But on the 3rd day Lucy decided to write them. He said that he had been thinking over the engagement, and told her that as he now had only 2,000 pounds, quite a small fortune, she was free to end the engagement to find another husband. He begged her to consider, as he did not want her to suffer in poverty with him. He never told her he was tired of her, or that he wished to marry Miss Morton. Lucy refused, however, insisting that she would never leave him. Just then, however, my friend arrived, so I left to come to the park. I know, however, that Edward has spoken of going to Oxford to study to become a minister. Then perhaps he could find work somewhere so they can marry."
Soon enough, they returned to their friends, and Elinor left with Mrs. Jennings, who was quite eager to hear the news. The next morning, a letter from Lucy Steele came for Elinor.
"I hope Miss Dashwood will be pleased in receiving a letter from me, as you are a dear friend, and I wish to tell you of my good fortune. Edward and I are quite well, as we are still desperately in love, and hope to marry soon. My dear Edward has said he will disregard his mother's anger, as he could not leave me, as he loves me too dearly. He will soon become a minister, and will be looking for employment. I hope you will recommend him to anybody that is in need of a minister's services, and I am sure dear Mrs. Jennings, too, will help us if she can. Perhaps she could ask Sir John or Mr. Palmer, or any friend that may be able to assist us in finding an income. Poor Anne was much to blame for what she did. But Edward and I are together, so I am no longer upset with her. I hope Mrs. Jennings will come visit us sometime soon. We would love to see her, and my cousins would be proud to know her. I hope you will tell Sir John and Lady Middleton and the dear children to remember us, and give my love to Miss Marianne. L.S.
As soon as Elinor had finished it, she gave it to Mrs. Jennings to read, as she knew Lucy's reason in writing to her was so Mrs. Jennings would be flattered by the letter and help her in some way. Mrs. Jennings was delighted with the letter.
Very well indeed. I wish I could employ him. She called me dear Mrs. Jennings, you see.
Chapter 39. The Miss Dashwoods had now been in town more than 2 months, and Marianne wished to be gone. She missed her mother and sister as well as the quiet country life. When the girls began talking about going back home, Mrs. Palmer suggested they go to Cleveland for a visit before going home. Cleveland, however, was in Somersetshire, near Magnicombe, Willoughby's country home.
Cleveland?
She cried.
No, I cannot go to Cleveland.
Elinor understood her sister's reason for not wishing to go to Cleveland, but she knew that traveling such a great distance would be safer with another family. Cleveland was not far from Barton, perhaps only a day's journey. They would as well not be staying long at Cleveland, and would return home shortly, so Marianne finally agreed. One morning Colonel Brandon was visiting Mrs. Jennings and her young guests, when he requested to talk to Elinor alone. He began speaking of his country home, explaining that it was not large, but was comfortable for a family. Elinor was quite confused as to his reasons for telling her of his home. After a short time, however, he explained that he would be willing to employ Edward there as his minister. The income was only £200 a year, but he wished for Elinor to offer this to him. What was she to do? It pained her to think of Edward marrying someone as impolite and deceitful as Lucy, but now she was expected to offer this income so the two could indeed marry. Chapter 40. She soon sent a note to Edward requesting that he go see her, as she had to speak to him about an important matter.
Colonel Brandon has desired me to offer you an income at his country home. It is about 200 a year, but may give you both a great deal of happiness,
she said quite nervously. Colonel Brandon? He said after a pause.
Yes,
continued Elinor.
Colonel Brandon wishes to help you in any manner he can, as he cares about you both very deeply.
Colonel Brandon give me an income? Can it be possible?
Indeed,
replied Elinor.
He is an excellent man, and wishes you happiness, just as I do.
Elinor then gave him Colonel Brandon's address, and he left, sincerely thanking her for her help, but looked pained as he spoke.
When I see him again,
said Elinor to herself as the door shut,
I shall see him as the husband of Lucy.
Chapter 41. After going to Colonel Brandon's to thank him for offering him an income, Edward then went to see Lucy. She was overjoyed at their good luck, and eagerly thanked Colonel Brandon and Elinor. It was now over a week since John Dashwood had visited them. Elinor thought that she must show proper manners and go see her sister-in-law. Marianne and Mrs. Jennings absolutely refused to go, as both of the women now had very little respect for Mrs. John Dashwood. Elinor went, but Mrs. Dashwood was resting, and therefore could not be disturbed. Just as she was leaving, John Dashwood came to greet her and invited her in. He seemed quite pleased to see her, as he had many questions about Colonel Brandon's offer to his brother. Is this true? Has Colonel Brandon really offered Edward an income? But they are not related, nor have any connection. Why would he offer such a generous position?
A very simple reason, to be a friend to Mr. Farrar.
Well, Edward is a very lucky man, but please do not mention this matter to Fanny. She is still quite upset over the engagement, he said quietly. You know, my dear Elinor, you will be happy to hear that Mrs. Ferrars has recently said that she would much prefer that Edward become engaged to you rather than to Lucy, as she has no fortune. Mrs. Ferrars is quite upset over this matter.
I thought she would have forgotten him by now. She does not know how Edward will make a living, but has declared that she no longer views him as her son.
Mrs. Ferrars can never forget that Edward is her son. She is one of the most loving mothers in the world. Elinor was silent. We think now, said Mr. Dashwood, of Robert marrying Miss Morton. Elinor smiled and calmly replied,
Miss Morton has no choice in who she is to marry. You speak as if Edward and Robert are the same person.
Certainly, there can be no difference. Robert will now be considered the oldest son and will receive his mother's fortune. Elinor was tired of talking to her foolish brother and said very little after that. Soon enough, Robert Ferrars arrived, and John Dashwood went to fetch his wife. He immediately began asking about Edward's future income working under Colonel Brandon. We make jokes about it, said he, but Edward is ruined, poor fellow. My mother was the first person to tell me of it, and I immediately said to her, Mother, I do not know what you plan to do, but if Edward does marry this young woman, I will never see him again. How shocking this is!
Have you ever seen the lady?
Yes, I saw her once when I came to visit Fanny, while she and her sister were here. She is quite an awkward country girl, without style or elegance. I remember her perfectly. He stopped speaking as Mrs. John Dashwood came into the room. She did not speak of Edward, but Elinor could see she was still quite upset. She was more polite toward Elinor during this visit, remarking that she wished they had spent more time together during their visit to London. Chapter 42. John Dashwood came for a short visit a few days later, before Elinor and Marianne would be going to Cleveland with the Palmers, Mrs. Jennings, and Colonel Brandon. Their brother congratulated them on traveling on so long a journey without any expense, as they would be going with the Palmers. Marianne was eager to leave London, as she had not had many hours of pleasure while there. She knew that Willoughby would now be busy making new plans without her. She thought about this without feeling too sad now. Elinor was anxious to leave as well. She had no longer wished to see Lucy Steele, as the foolish girl had caused Elinor a great deal of pain and suffering. She wished to return to Barton quickly, and spent many quiet days with their mother, which she hoped would calm her sister. They arrived at Cleveland 2 days later. Marianne was delighted to be in the quiet country again, and spent her days walking around the area, sometimes crying, thinking that Willoughby's home was so close. Mrs. Palmer was pleased that the Dashwood girls had come, and treated them with cheerful warmth. Her husband, as well, was quite a gentleman, and Elinor found him to be quite tender and caring, although he occasionally became upset with his wife and her mother. As Marianne spent long hours on walks outside, she quickly caught a cold. She was forced to stay indoors for the next day or two till her health improved. Chapter 43. The next morning Marianne got up early, hoping that her illness had been cured. She spent the day in front of the fireplace, but her health had only worsened. The Palmers' doctor was called to the house, who declared that Marianne indeed had an infection. Such a word greatly alarmed Mrs. Palmer, as she feared her young child might soon become ill. She announced she would take her child to stay at a neighbor's home until Marianne's health improved. She, as well, demanded that her husband go along. He was not pleased to have to leave the party, however. Mrs. Jennings declared that she would remain with Marianne until her health improved. Upon hearing such tender words, Elinor came to greatly love and respect that old woman. Colonel Brandon stayed as well, worried about Marianne's health. For the next few days, Marianne's health did not improve, although the doctor came to see her every day. A short time later one night, Elinor became quite worried as her sister had quite a high fever and was speaking wildly.
"Is Mamma coming?" "Not yet,"
replied Elinor in terror.
"but she will be here soon, I hope." "But she must not come through London,"
cried Marianne.
"I shall never see her if she goes to London."
Elinor realized that Marianne was indeed quite ill and called the doctor immediately. Colonel Brandon saw her great alarm and offered to go to Barton to fetch Mrs. Dashwood, as Marianne might soon die. Elinor was grateful for his care and support. The next day, Marianne's health had improved greatly. Mrs. Dashwood and Colonel Brandon were expected to return the next evening at 10 o'clock. Elinor was anxiously waiting, but was rather confused when she heard a carriage arrive at 8 o'clock. Soon enough, Willoughby walked into the room and greeted her nervously. Never in her life had Elinor found it so difficult to be calm. Chapter 44. Elinor looked at him in terror, unable to speak. She then began to walk out of the room. "Miss Dashwood, please stay for a few minutes. I must speak with you."
"No, sir,"
she replied firmly.
"I shall not stay."
"Please, I will speak quickly, but I came to speak with you."
"With me?"
she exclaimed in astonishment.
"Well, sir, speak quickly."
"Please, tell me," he began, "how is she doing?"
"She has improved in the last day, but she is still quite ill."
Willoughby was silent, looking quite worried after hearing the news. He then began again. "When I first met your family, I had no plans to fall in love with your sister. I simply wanted to spend my time pleasantly in the country. Your sister's lovely behavior was kind and gentle, but I must admit that my plan at the beginning was only to be pleasing to her, without returning her love." Miss Dashwood then looked at him with anger, saying,
"Please do not pain me by telling me anything more on the subject."
"I insist that you hear the whole story," he replied. "My fortune was never large, and I had always spent a great deal of money. In recent years, I have collected a large debt. My aunt, Mrs. Smith, has planned to give me a great deal of her fortune, but it has never been certain. Therefore, I had planned to marry a wealthy woman. So, you see, when I first met your sister, I had no plans to marry her. My behavior, I know, was mean, selfish, and cruel. At that time, I did not know how terribly I was treating your sister, as I did not know what it was to love. But I believe I know now. So as to keep my expensive habits, I married a wealthy woman, instead of living a rather poor life with your sister."
"You did then,"
said Elinor.
"at one time love her?"
"Yes, I was sincerely fond of her, and planned to tell her. That last day before I left, Mrs. Smith had found out of my love affair with another young woman, which I am sure you have heard about. Mrs. Smith demanded that I immediately return to London to see the girl. You must remember that you have only heard one side. I know I was guilty, but she was weak and passionate and did not understand. I perhaps should have treated her better, but she was guilty as well."
"Your indifference, however, towards that unfortunate girl is no apology for your cruel treatment of her. While you were enjoying yourself in the country, always happy, she was suffering in the worst way."
"I tell you I did not know. he warmly replied. "I did give her my address, and she should have known how to contact me."
"What did Mrs. Smith say?"
"She told me to leave immediately, so I went to see Marianne quickly before I left. I was confused when I went to see her. Just a few hours before this terrible event, I had planned to ask Marianne to marry me, but when Mrs. Smith found out about my previous love affair, I knew she would never give me the fortune she promised. Then I knew I could never marry Marianne without a fortune."
"Well, sir, have you forgotten what happened in London?"
"Ah, the infamous letter. Did she let you read it?"
"I have read all her letters."
Elinor replied calmly. "At first, I decided not to respond to her note, as I had just become engaged to Miss Grey. Soon after, however, I thought I should go for a visit, acting as a distant friend. So, one day, I watched you and your sister leave with Mrs. Jennings. Then I went to the house."
"You watched us leave?"
"Yes, I often watched you two walking down the street, but I never attempted to speak to your sister. I felt quite guilty when I saw your sister looking quite pale at the party in town. She looked miserable, and I felt terrible, so I left immediately. Miss Grey had heard of a girl I was interested in, and supposed Marianne was the same girl, and she became quite envious."
"But the letter, Mr. Willoughby, your own letter, what do you have to say about that?"
"Yes, that letter. Your sister wrote me again, the very next morning. I was having breakfast with Sophia, and she saw a letter for me. She opened it immediately, expecting it to be from the mysterious girl she had seen at the party. She was quite angry with me, and demanded that she write the letter to Marianne, insisting that I was not in love with her. What do you think of my wife's style of writing?"
"Your wife? The letter was in your own handwriting."
"Yes, but I had copied what she wrote. Writing that letter was so difficult, as I knew I would no longer be considered a dear friend of your family, and I understood how deeply this would hurt your sister."
"You are very wrong, Mr. Willoughby,"
said Elinor, although she did now feel pity for him.
"You must not speak badly about your wife now."
"Do not talk to me of my wife," he said sadly. "She does not love me, and never loved me. And now, do you pity me? My intentions were not always wrong. I hope you will explain to your sister what I have told you."
"Yes, I will."
"Well, I must leave then. I shall now go away and live in fear of one event."
"What do you mean?"
"Your sister's marriage." Chapter 45. After Willoughby's departure, Elinor sat wondering about his situation, somewhat pitying him. However, her mother soon arrived with Colonel Brandon, and she happily explained that her other daughter was no longer suffering, and was improving quickly. She then explained the event that had just passed. Mrs. Dashwood did indeed pity him for his current situation. However, she soon informed Elinor that Colonel Brandon had admitted he was in love with Marianne.
"My Elinor, I must tell you Colonel Brandon loves Marianne. He's told me so himself."
Elinor was overjoyed for him, but still pitied poor Willoughby a bit.
"He told me yesterday as we were travelling that he has loved Marianne since they first met."
Mrs. Dashwood said.
"His love for her is far stronger than Willoughby's." "What did you tell him?" "Oh, my love, I could give him no answer, as I thought my dear Marianne might be at that moment dying. He was confident in his feelings, however, and I did not need an answer from me. He knows that he must wait, as Marianne has recently been hurt and is still quite young."
Chapter 46. Soon enough Marianne was well enough to receive visitors. Colonel Brandon looked quite upset at seeing her look so pale and sickly, remembering the look of his dear Eliza before her death. Marianne fully recovered in nearly 4 days, and the family made plans to return to Barton Cottage. Colonel Brandon agreed to take them home, which they were grateful for. Marianne and Elinor were sincerely upset in having to leave Mrs. Jennings. They were grateful to her kind support, and so full of respect for her. As they approached Barton, Marianne began to cry, overjoyed to be home, but still hurt, remembering the time she had had there with Willoughby. One morning, a few days after they had arrived home, Elinor and Marianne were taking a walk when Marianne stopped, looking towards a nearby hill.
"There, exactly there I fell, and there I first saw Willoughby."
After a few moments of silence, she began to speak again.
"I do not regret falling in love with him, but I wish I could know that he was not always cheating me and that poor unfortunate girl." "Will you feel better if you do know?" "Yes, my heart will then be at peace."
Elinor then explained the story of Willoughby's arriving at Cleveland. Marianne listened in silence, sometimes crying quietly to herself. Marianne then realized that the amusement she and Willoughby shared was in laughing at others, and she had suffered greatly since it ended. She knew that she had once loved him, but she could never feel such emotions after knowing his true character. Chapter 47. That evening, when the family was sitting together, Marianne began speaking about Willoughby.
"It was a great relief to me what Elinor told me this morning. I have now heard exactly what I wished to hear. I wish for no change. I never could have been happy with him after knowing all this. I now have no regrets, nothing but my own foolishness." "Rather your mother's foolishness, my child,"
said Mrs. Dashwood. During this time, Elinor was becoming more impatient to hear of Edward's plans. She had heard nothing of him since she had left London. One morning, one of their servants returned from doing business at Mrs. Ferrars's country home. "I suppose you know, ma'am, that Mr. Ferrars is married," he informed Elinor. Marianne began screaming and was taken to her room. In the meantime, Elinor turned pale, but continued to remain calm.
"Who told you that Mr. Ferrars was married?"
she asked. "I saw Mr. Ferrars myself this morning. He was with Miss Steele, as they have recently married." The rest of the day Elinor tried to look calm so her family would not worry, but she was quite upset after hearing the news of Lucy Steele marrying Edward. Chapter 48. Elinor now realized the difference between the expectation of an unpleasant event and the certainty of the event. She was still shocked and upset after hearing of the marriage. She had always hoped that while Edward was still single, there was some hope of his ending the engagement to Lucy, but now there was no hope. She was not surprised that they had gotten married so quickly, as Lucy would most likely want to secure her marriage. They would soon be settled near Colonel Brandon's country home at Delaford. The next day, Elinor was shocked to see Edward arriving at the cottage. He looked pale and nervous when he arrived. He was silent for some time, so Elinor began speaking.
"Is Mrs. Ferrars in London?"
"Yes, my mother is in London."
"No, I meant Mrs. Edward Ferrars,"
Elinor said quietly. "Perhaps you mean my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars?"
"Mrs. Robert Ferrars?"
Marianne exclaimed. "You must not know. You may not have heard that my brother has recently married Miss Lucy Steele." Chapter 49. Elinor almost ran out of the room after hearing the news, but remained near Edward. After hearing of his brother's wedding, Edward immediately left Oxford, where he was studying, to go to Barton to ask Elinor to marry him. Robert Ferrars had gone to see Lucy, hoping to persuade her to end the engagement with his brother. He had gone to meet her several times, each time hoping to end the engagement. She flattered him considerably during their meetings, and he loved hearing such comments about himself. Within a short time, they had persuaded each other to marry. Lucy supposed that Colonel Brandon's offer was not enough of an income for her taste, and was looking for other ways to become wealthy. Edward stayed with the Dashwoods for nearly a week, during which time the new lovers often discussed Lucy's marriage. During one of their conversations, Edward gave her a letter Lucy had sent him.
Dear Sir, I am quite sure you no longer love me, therefore I have found someone who will love me, and have no doubt I will be happy with him. I sincerely wish you happy in your choice, and it shall not be my fault if we are not always good friends, as you are now my brother. I love your brother, and we have just returned from getting married. I have burned all your letters, and hope you will destroy my notes to you, but the ring of hair you are welcome to keep. Lucy Ferrars.
My mother will be more hurt in Robert marrying Lucy, as he was her favorite. She will forgive him more quickly as well. I thought it was my duty to continue with Lucy, although I was no longer in love with her. We had become engaged the year after I left her uncle's home. For the first year, I loved her dearly, as I was bored with my studies at Oxford and living at my mother's home, so our secret love was my amusement. After nearly a year, however, I realized that Lucy was quite foolish and rather dishonest. I thought it was my duty to give her the option to continue the engagement. The two lovers soon decided that Edward should return to his mother to beg for her forgiveness. Then, after a short time, he would announce his engagement to Elinor. They hoped that his mother would give them a small fortune, but they still had doubts about Mrs. Ferrars's generosity. Letters soon came to the cottage from their friends. Mrs. Jennings was quite upset with her dishonest cousin. When she had run off to marry Robert Ferrars, she had taken her sister's money as well and refused to take her along. Mrs. Jennings had to give the poor girl some money to go stay with another cousin, hoping to see the doctor again. Chapter 50. Edward apologized a great deal to his mother, and she soon forgave him, not wishing to continue having problems with her children any longer. She attempted to persuade him to marry the Honorable Miss Morton, but Edward insisted that he wished only to marry Elinor. Mrs. Ferrars at last agreed to the marriage. As for their fortune, she promised them £1,000 a year, which was a great deal more than they had hoped for. They were soon married and moved to their new home in Devonshire. Their friends and family, including the Dashwoods and Mrs. Ferrars, visited them. After some time, Mrs. Ferrars forgave her second son and his low-class wife. Soon enough, however, Lucy used her abilities to flatter her mother-in-law and soon became one of their mother's favorites, settling with her husband in town, where they received a great fortune from his mother. Aside from Robert and Lucy's fights and disagreements, they lived happily together and became close friends of John and Fanny Dashwood. Mrs. Ferrars, however, could never completely forgive Edward for once becoming engaged to Lucy, nor could she forgive Elinor for marrying Edward, though she had a greater fortune and was of higher class than Lucy. Marianne soon recovered from her heartache at 17. She began spending a great deal of time with Colonel Brandon, and came to greatly respect him. She realized in time that she indeed cared for the Colonel. After 2 years, she and the Colonel were happily married, and she grew to love him more than she had ever loved Willoughby. Willoughby was pained after hearing of Marianne's marriage to Colonel Brandon. Soon after his marriage, Mrs. Smith forgave him for his terrible behavior, and gave him the fortune he once so desperately needed, which made him think that if he had treated Marianne well, he could have been happy and rich. He did grow to love his wife, but always viewed Marianne as the true image of womanly perfection. Between Barton and Delaford there was always communication, as Mrs. Dashwood had decided to keep her cottage while Margaret was still so young, though she often stayed with her 2 daughters, who lived in happiness with their husbands, who became great friends as well.